Duggan here. Richard is, I'm going to read this because I might get it wrong. He's a regional editor Northwest for Newsquest. And here on my left is Paul Foster from the University of Portsmouth. So before we head into the questions, I'm going to hit you with some numbers here because I thought I'd have a little bit of a look around at the data surrounding court coverage and crime coverage in the Reach's live network, and that's the regional titles within Reach PLC, which is the parent company of the Liverpool Echo. And since January the 1st, we've written almost 49,000 stories that can count as crime. And we've written 27,000 stories from the courts. Those stories with a crime tag have been read 188 million times, and the courts 122 million times. I think there's quite a false narrative around regional press that we're all chained to our desks writing dozens of stories a day. I think this sort of tells a different story, really. Court and crime is very, very much key to what we do, and I think we play a really important role in ensuring justice is indeed done. So today, hopefully, we're going to find out a little bit about how the regional press is covering the courts, and also a little bit about the challenges. Obviously, the regional teams are smaller than they would have been, say, a decade ago, which inevitably means there are fewer people covering crime in courts, but also about the opportunities and how we shape our coverage for a digital audience. So first of all, I was going to ask you, Paul, if those figures sort of are true across the industry. Is that something that you recognise?
Yeah, and I think the whole concept of this, when we first thought about what this panel could be, I was just talking to a couple of editors on a couple of different local newspaper companies, and they were both mentioned about how crime and court stories, particularly court stories, they were seeing a big spike in traffic and analytics, and so that got me thinking actually. And then when we got Newsquest to deliver some really good some statistics and dive into the analytics. So let's have a look through some of the analytics first. So firstly, page views, so a big spike. Court stories have had a huge jump, almost 20% up year on year. This is Newsquest group wide. Looking at dwell time, obviously not as much, but dwell time still going up. This is year on year from 24 to 25. Obviously demonstrates people are engaging longer with this type of stories. But it's with conversion rates. That's where we're really seeing court stories come into their own, really. So the registration from court stories increased by 4.6%. So that's signing up for registering for the website. But also subscriptions. So people clicking on a court story and then deciding to subscribe, become a loyal customer, loyal consumer of that product, of that news organisation. That's gone up 27.1%. So we haven't got statistics across the board, but anecdotally speaking, we can see that's happening. So again, it's great figures, great for court reporting, great for the regional news as well. I'm just going to pass on to Richard. You can obviously, he's the boots on the ground, so you can explain a bit more about what's going on.
So we've got the conversion rates there. So a big thing as part of Newsquest strategy is getting people to subscribe to our websites. Ultimately, people used to buy newspapers and there wasn't the internet. Then the internet came along and caused a bit of a head scratcher for us all. And one thing we're trying to do is get people to appreciate that if they want high quality local journalism, they are going to have to invest in it. And part of that is by saying, please pay a small amount per month to support your local newspaper, your regional newspaper. So, for example, here we've got two stories here from Liverpool, the Northern Echo and the Telegraph and Argus, both of which are crime and court, both of which brought in really decent numbers of subscribers. I think as of my figures on Monday, that Northern Echo live blog has brought in more conversions than any other story has this year, which I think it was 55 just from that one live blog, which you might not think that sounds a huge amount, but if you cover a trial every day and you bring in dozens of subscribers for one trial every day and you retain them, that's pretty impressive for the long-term strategy.
Is that paid subscribers?
Yeah, so paid subscribers. So we regularly run different types of sales. So I think at the moment it's some mad offering where it's £4 for 4 months, which how can you argue with that, really? And then after that, it's £5 a month. So we're not asking the earth when it comes to people paying for high-quality journalism, but every subscription does make a big difference. And when we started our subscription strategy, the biggest driver of the subs to digital subs was sport. And that has actually changed now. So we feel what we've done, if we've reached a certain level with sport, we've probably got in the majority of our loyal sports audiences. So my biggest sports teams in my patches are Bolton Wanderers and Blackburn Rovers. We know generally we've got most of that core audience subscribing month on month. We'll still pick up a few here and there when it's transfer deadline day, but what's really bringing people to us is our court coverage, and that's why I'm so keen on making sure I have someone in court for the Bolton News every single day and for the Lancashire Telegraph every single day, and even for my weekly titles, some of which are very small, trying to have someone in where we have the resource is really, really important. So while there is still some way to go in terms of convincing people to have that same level of interest with crime, there's still a bit of a balance there. If there's a major incident in Bolton Town Centre, I don't want to close that article off to people to be able to read it. But if there's a court story which has involved taking someone out of the newsroom for 3 weeks, I don't think it's unreasonable to say to people, actually, I'd like you to subscribe to read that article. So here are some examples of individual stories and the conversions they've brought in. So I don't know what's happened there, but the Bolton News is my biggest title in the Northwest. This one story here, this lovely gentleman done for causing serious injury by dangerous driving. 17 people took out a digital subscription to read that story. That clearly shows that he's probably quite well known in the area and people generally are quite interested. Another one here, again, not particularly nice story. A sex offender who's been slammed by the judge over his offending. 12 people took out a digital subscription to read that story. Anecdotally, I do find if someone is well known in the area and you choose to what we call hard gate a story, people will take out a digital subscription purely out of curiosity, but then they'll stay with us.
Do you want to explain Hardgate then?
Yeah, so hard gating is effectively where you will hit a paywall where it says you need to subscribe to read this story. It's not just court, and it's not every court story, so we will make a decision in the newsroom as to whether we hard gate a story or we make it more readily accessible. For example, all my nostalgia content from our archive at the Bolton News is hard-gated pretty much because that takes a lot of effort to have an archive and a lot of money goes into that. So we don't, again, think it's unreasonable to say to people, please pay £5 a month to be able to read these excellent stories. So all the stories I'm showing you in these slides are what we would call hard-gated. So that means you have to take out or have a digital subscription to read them. So Warrington Guardian is my biggest weekly title, and it's not just Crown Court or Magistrates, it's Inquest as well. So this story here about an inquest opening, we made the decision to hardgate this one, and I think everyone on the panel knows how difficult it can be to report an inquest and how much pushback you can get from people. So sometimes we will make the decision to hardgate an inquest, and this one brought in 12 subscribers, 12 people wanting to know what happened here. Again, the Wirral Globe, which Maria will know, much smaller title on her patch, but even a small weekly newspaper like the Wirral Globe, this story here about an incident in a Birkenhead pub, 4 people took out a digital subscription for that. So it's a range of stories from the courts that are bringing people into our website. A big part of Newsquest strategy is trying to embrace AI, and I know that immediately makes people think, oh God, what do they mean when they embrace AI? So we have what are called AI-assisted reporters, and they do non-contentious stories. So property of the week, they can turn around really quickly. If Bolton Council wants to offer free bike lessons in one of the local parks, they can turn that around. Really easy stories that we need to fill our print products, but also we know is interest from our readers, that don't need someone to be chained to their desk, to use Maria's phrase. And what that AI-assisted reporter scheme is doing is helping me get my fully trained digital journalist out in court every single day, and it is paying dividends already. So one of my reporters, Tabitha, in the Warrington team, she can turn around 45 stories a day using the AI-assisted report tool. Tabitha is the real exception to the rule. She's the real top end. The average we'd expect is 20, but it is making a really, really big difference to getting people out on the ground. And again, it is filling gaps in papers. So lots of newspapers changed their templates a few years ago to really minimise the story count. We're actually now increasing our story count and putting more stories in the paper, whether it's nibs, whether it's just little pieces, just to make sure that our readers of our print products are getting quality for their money. Do you hand back over to you to talk about our other titles? The other titles in Newsquest?
I think just before we do that, I'd just like to sort of move on to Sean really
Yeah,
quickly, if that's okay, because last time we did any significant sort of market research in a traditional sense at Liverpool Echo, the finding was too much crime, but the data tells another story of people not being honest.
Readers are big fat liars. Yeah, it's been the case since the start of my career that at the Hull Daily Mail we used to have this thing called Happy News, and if you got the Happy News box, like a nib box, in your basket or the content system, you would just curse because you had to find 3 check presentations, charity, whatever, like something happy.
You don't strike me as a happy reporter.
I'm quite happy, but but when you're dealing with crime and day in, day out, it does kind of warp your sense of stuff. And Happy News was really annoying, everyone hated it, but it was prefaced with this thing, like, our readers tell us we don't do enough positive stories. And they do, it's like, all the research is that, you do too much crime, it's all negative, I hate it, but then like sales spike when there's a big horrible murder on the front page. And I had an editor who is sadly no longer with us, but I still, so I can't defame him anyway. But but he used to, like, if he was on a Friday, because Friday's a big court day, they do a lot of sentences, you come back with a book full of stories, and you eke them out over the weekend, right? And he used to say, oh, can't put that on the front, doesn't pass the breakfast test, People are sitting around with their kids on a Saturday morning, they don't want to read about that, and it's like, actually, Mel, whenever you do, sales go up, right? So yeah, I think recognition of that has to play a part in editorial decisions, and that you can't put too much store in the data that you get from surveys and focus groups and things like that. I think you have to be a bit more sort of driven by the numbers,
The real data.
Now, yeah. And I think when it's done well as well, it can play a part in that education I was talking about earlier, because a lot of people don't know much about the justice system, and it is, so it's useful as well as sensational.
Yeah. Just sort of thinking a little bit about my own experience, because Liverpool's obviously seen its fair share of high-profile crime and court cases over the past few years, from the Southport stabbings have already been referenced to the crash at the LFC Victory Parade recently. And I've thought a little bit as I was preparing for this, changes to how journalists are perceived in these situations. I know as a reporter I covered race riots in places like Oldham, and while there's obviously, there was always the awareness that you could get caught up in it, there could be injury, I never felt like a target as such, and certainly in the violent disorder after Southport, journalists, photographers, our photographer were targeted, and so there is that change, I think, in perception in terms of the coverage of crime. I think resilience again has been talked about, but it's really important that journalists are taught resilience. I think we do need to be out there covering that. We do need to be in the courtrooms covering the aftermath, though we understand how challenging that can be. So I think the NCTJ has done some really valuable work around sort of safety, and we've now got hard hats in the newsroom, which I never had in my whole career. But also looking at sort of people from a pastoral element. I think there's people in that newsroom who didn't come in to cover crime or courts, and it's important that we look after their well-being. I think today's not the time for it, but I think the relationship with our police forces is really important. I know there is work going on around that, but it is incredibly important that we are able to deliver the trusted news. And I think there's There's a grab from Google that we saw at the LFC Victory Parade that I'm sure most of you would be familiar with. And immediately after that that happened, search spike for Liverpool Echo absolutely shot up. It's 90-degree angle, huge amount of search. And I think that is really reassuring for the whole of regional journalism, really, that in this very difficult age of misinformation, disinformation, whatever you want to call it, people do turn to us in times of need because they do trust us. And I think we've really had to shift a little bit. We're not reporting on crime in the same way that we used to, but we're sort of helping form the narrative a little bit. I don't know if that's obviously the high profile element of covering crime, but what about the more day to day?
Well, the day-to-day, well, we're seeing the biggest spike is the in the court sort of section. So back in my day when I was a former regional news editor, we used to run the in the court section, court lists, where we'd print all the sort of people who have been convicted, and then you'd await the phone call from disgruntled people saying, "You can't put me in the paper." Yes, I can. And that would happen many times a week.
They just email you now.
Just email, yeah.
And do you find it easy to get those court lists? Is that works really well?
If you have an established news, it's more for the newer reporters. I think it's a bit more of a pain. There's a lot more security in it now. You have to prove who you are. Whereas when I was a reporter 8 years ago, you just ring up and they go, "Okay, give us your email address," and they'd send it off. There wasn't a huge amount of security.
We used to have to go and collect them. I'm that old.
Oh.
Like, actually.
Oh yeah, I remember doing that. Yeah.
And then when they moved to email, they were like, "We can only send them to a secure email address."
Yeah.
And I was like, okay. But I gather from various things that it's better now.
I think it really depends on the court.
Yeah, of course.
But the interesting thing is the court list, as your data shows, is driving subscriptions. And driving traffic as well. So I think I think you've got the stats there. I think 4 of the top 10 biggest driving stories in the Newsquest group were court lists. People in the dock, wasn't it? So
We love it in the dock. We love it in the dock.
Everything goes full circle.
Well, it's
doesn't
it's the rubberneck and it's the naming and shaming. It's is my neighbour in court? And one of my neighbours has been in court. So this one here, we do this in Bolton every week. 5 cases you've heard from magistrates, and it's a combination. It can be ones that we've been and seen ourselves, ones from Court's Desk, which was a brilliant tool where you can search for listings. So this story here, people taken to court for dropping fag ends. I've never been taken to court for dropping a fag end, but I have been fined for it, and it's bloody annoying. But don't do it, put it in a bin. Is the message there? And we got don't do it. But and I've learnt the hard way. But we got so many complaints from people about this. But it formed part of this narrative of this is what the justice system is. This is what you can be taken to court for. So pay your fines, basically. Don't do it. But they're just such easy pieces of stories to put together. People are really interested in them. And it is the rubbernecking thing. But we do in the dock for Bolton, Lancashire, Warrington every single week. And there are so many stories, you could do them every day, but we don't, because we don't want to, going back to that conversation about crime, we don't want to oversaturate people with it. So it's just a little snippet of what's going on in your local court. But so if for the Lancashire Telegraph, I have a reporter in Magistrates Court every single day, and he brings us the most incredible cases that would just go missed otherwise. And going back to what I was saying about the AI strategy, as we're able to free reporters to be up more, I want us to be going out and being in Magistrates Court more often, because there are so many cases there that I think really show us what's going on. So, for example, Bolton might have a really high rate of littering or dropping fag ends, etc. Lancashire might have a huge issue with drink driving. Over time, you can go into these things and look and see if there are any patterns. So the more we can get reporters in Magistrates Court, which I do think is criminally underreported on, the better. And what I would really like to do eventually is start getting my reporters in Family Court, which I think there's so many interesting stories to tell there too, but we just haven't had the resource to do it. And I'm hoping the strategy will allow us to start being even more present in court and really telling those stories.
Sorry, just touching on Family Court, because I know we talked about it briefly before, and I know the current LDR cohort, I can never say that word, are allowed to cover Family Court, but the take-up has been quite slow. How do we expand that? How do we make that work?
That's a very good question, which is what people say when they don't have an answer.
Sorry.
It's a very good
You can
question.
tell we've not rehearsed, can't you?
I'm a bit making light of it, but it's a really difficult problem, and it's something that, because I was on the transparency implementation group for the family courts, led by the president of the family division, Sir Andrew McFarlane, who was very keen that we have people covering courts, and I was the media rep on this, and there was me and a media law barrister called Guy Vassell-Adams, who was the voice of the media on this group. And at every meeting, we were just like, yeah, the issue you're going to have with this, because they were all thinking like safeguarding and, you know, is the sky going to fall in? We were like, the issue you're going to have is getting people there. And I'm really heartened to hear Richard's grand master plan that's getting more people into court. But there were conversations in Leeds, I believe, because it was one of the pilot family courts, where the judges were genuinely terrified that on the first day of the pilot, there was going to be like hundreds of journalists on the train up from London descending on their court and trying to write about everything. And of course, that did not happen. I think there's a programme of education to be done. So obviously that's something that the group had focused on in the past, that we created a kind of guidance. Louise Tickle's been very good on this. She's done some stuff with the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, and they've been good on this. So there are pockets. I know there's a reporter called Conor Gogarty in Wales who's done some really good family reporting. And you know, I think the stuff we have seen shows the potential is there. There is a massive issue in England and Wales with secure care placements for children who have like such horrendous kind of levels of need. And the tragedy is there are not enough of these places, so they end up being effectively imprisoned. It's called a deprivation of liberty order, to use the legalese, in totally unsuitable places like caravans, holiday homes, with carers who have to monitor them round the clock because they might harm themselves or someone else. And that is a situation that has only been highlighted by successive judges in the family court sounding off about it in the presence of a court reporter. And it's been taken up. I know Sancha Berg at the BBC's done a lot on it, and Jason Farrell at Sky as well. So it's out there. There's still nothing being done about it, by the way. But I think these stories show, they're sort of the systemic ones that you were talking about. They show that there's a real need for people to actually go and find out what's going on in those courts. And I think I think that message needs to be proliferated really, and hopefully those conversations can be had, because as an editor, it's resource intensive.
Well, we've got to, we're there to hold power to account, but we just haven't been able to be there as much as we need to be. But
it's complex the way it works
Yeah.
when you compare it to the magistrates and the court, the Crown Court.
One of the things that has been sort of set up, it could be improved, and depends on the court, because we know it's very inconsistent. It's sort of like a local meeting with the judges and the local journalists and other interested people, and that is really like the most effective way, because family court lists are impenetrable. You have to understand a complex set of codes to try and work out what it might be about, and so they don't have very much information at all on them. And so you can't just look at a list and Google some names, and like we do with crim lists. But so those conversations happening locally, I think, is the
building
key.
relationships.
It's building the
isn't it, I
relationships.
think,
It's having judges like when I worked at the High Court. Obviously, the family division is there, and there've been several very high-profile cases there, and there were some judges there who used to get their clerks to ring us if they wanted to sound off. And I think that sort of replicated locally, where judges are not fearful of the journalists and and lawyers as well are not fearful of the journalists, and the journalists know, where.
Yeah, they can use us, can't they?
Exactly.
They can use us to highlight
So those
their
conversations, I think, are the way in.
points. Amazing.
But then
Thank you.
who feels that for you? That's the trouble, isn't it? So it's great that Richard can try and do that, but on a bigger scale.
Well, it might be wishful thinking. It probably is wishful thinking, but that's the ultimate aim, isn't it? To be able to say that's what we'd like to do. But I mean, I think we've all come across obstructive judges, clerks, barristers, solicitors. We still get that in the Crown Court. Yeah, I'm on a list of people that don't like barristers that don't like me. But we have that in Crown and magistrates at the moment, and we've still not over that yet. So family is going to be another thing that we've got to do. But we need to stop being seen as the enemy. We are there to help.
Yeah.
Be the eyes and ears to the public, as my old lecturer used to constantly drill into me.
And so just maybe finally, and inspired by seeing Caroline in the room, partly, we've talked a lot really about words, about how we cover courts through words, whether that's your presentation was really interesting, whether that's live coverage of the courts, etc. But increasingly people don't get their news through the written word, they get it through audio or through video, and I guess the regional media has been quite slow to adopt the podcast, etc. I know we did do one video once of a court case that we did the interview with the leading detective, the court reporter, and our crime reporter, and it had over 100,000 views on YouTube. So there is an appetite, but again, I guess it's sometimes. But are we missing a trick, and where should we be going, do you think?
Well, yeah, I think podcasts are obviously it's the zeitgeist word, isn't it? People always said, "Oh, let's do a podcast," but I think you can build a deeper relationship with the audience as well. And I think what the regional press need to do really is to fathom out is it these one-off podcasts that you can do, but you can have 100,000 people and then disappear, or is it can you put the resource into it? It is quite resourceful, intensive. Sport do it quite well. They've built an audience. Can news do it that way? And it's been successful with the Mail, isn't it? They've seen a big spike in traffic and people paying for podcasts. So why couldn't it happen for regional news? Perhaps is there that interest on a monthly basis, or do you pick and choose the case that you go to? I don't know what your thoughts are.
Do we have to, Richard? I mean, is that where the audience is? Are we being stupid?
I mean, we have a discussion in my newsroom all the time because the sports podcasts do really well, and and we'd love to replicate that in news. And we've talked about, do we do kind of a weekly roundup of the biggest stories and try and reach people that way? But there is, I mean, you covered Harold Chipman. There are so many cases like Harold Chipman that are so worthy. If you get a case at that level now, that is so worthy of a podcast because of the interest. But a small local case like that, charming gentleman from Mills, is anyone? Are there enough people there to warrant it? So I still think there is something to be done there, but I don't know whether it needs more of a roundup, a bit like the newsletters, a bit like in the doc. These are the people who are in court this week, sort of thing, and then you wait for those really awful but very, very gripping cases and do individual. I'd love to do that if when eventually that does come my way, but it is just the resource, unfortunately.
Yeah, and it is. It should be resource intensive because I've put my legal hat on, and I find it terrifying because if you're doing a broadcast news piece on a court case, it might be a few minutes, 2 or 3 maybe.
Yeah, probably max. I mean, unless it's obviously you've come to the end and you've got a big background.
Yeah.
I mean, the Philpots, for example, we did an entire program.
Yeah.
And then we did a separate program for the network.
But in a bulletin, it's generally a short amount of time, and when you're doing
45 seconds to a minute and a half.
a podcast, it's 20-30 minutes, and it's, I think, then it becomes a lot more serious in terms of like legaling properly.
Yeah.
So that's something to be cautious of. And the format as well, I think, needs some consideration because people don't necessarily just want like
To be talked about.
yeah. I went into Cardiff last year and spoke to some of Sandra's students, and 2 of them marvellously came running up to me at the end because they'd done a podcast called Finishing Each Other's Sentencing. And they talk about like they've been to Mag's Court and they just discuss like these various cases, and they were like, oh, it's a bit rough and ready. But it was pretty good because they were really just having that conversation about
Sometimes about the
societal-
passion, isn't
yeah,
it? Not
and the
production,
societal
I think,
issues
yeah.
that come out of the cases that we, you know, come up with, and they're having those like as an accessible kind of friendly chat between two pretty funny young men, you know. So something like that. I mean, maybe someone could get in touch with them.
Yeah.
Gary Lineker, yeah. Any?
We're sort of running out of time. So, Paul, any final thoughts?
No, I think the analytics show that it can work, and you know, crime in court has always been the bread and butter for local news, and I undertook some focus groups recently, and that come up multiple times actually about they go to these you know, mainstream media you know, for court and crime stories to be kept informed, and I think, as you said, to gossip and find out the gossip. The only concern I've got is that void. Is that how do we fill that void? It's great that you're sending people to magistrates, but not every editor can do that. It's a bit of a shame that the LDR, Local Democracy Reporting Scheme, could not be expanded. Or there's no mood music to try and expand that. You know, so it's quite unfortunate the BBC Director General didn't sort of talk about that in his recent speech. So that's where I am at.
Amazing. Richard, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, going back to the happy stories thing, I do get that from readers. Readers do fib about whether they want happy, because they do like happy stories, but they don't read them in their droves in comparison to court and crime. It's such bread and butter for what we do, and we're going to continue to do it, and we're going to continue to do it well, and the appetite is there for it. So the reader needs to accept that they do like it, but I think it is they do like it, and they are going to get it. But we also, I think, have a duty to not make it all doom and gloom, because if I look at Bolton News goes out 6 days a week, I don't want it to be murder, crime, theft, just misery all week. We have to break it up, because otherwise people just get down on where they live, and that doesn't help.
Some court stories are funny though.
Oh, some of them are hilarious.
Really funny. I mean, I am kind of more positive than I was probably when I spoke to Richard, because I think there is more recognition of actually, is this something where we've kind of thrown the baby out of the bathwater with cuts and we need it back, and it is valuable and people are enjoying it and reading it. And I think any sort of measures, Richard mentioned Court's Desk, and they can plug some gaps, because you can effectively produce a court report from magistrates' court lists, which is a bit scary. It's an AI tool. It's not that good, right? So it's not going to steal your job, but it means that a court case that wouldn't have been
Yeah, it provides a service.
that wouldn't have been heard of can just be produced quite easily. And the idea is to have kind of either virtually or physically a reporter in every court. And I think that is even more possible now because of the sort of advancements of technology. So no excuses.
So you're feeling quite positive.
Yeah, let's fill in the gaps.
Excellent. And we are bang on time. And just finished out.
Thanks. We're talking about newspapers and broadcasting. That was back time like a true radio professional. That was fantastic. So thanks. That was such a great discussion, and we're going to have a break just for a few moments, and then we'll be back for another great panel coming up just at 2 o'clock. So thank you to all, and I'll ask the next group to come forward: Mark, Andrew, Nick, and Georgia. Time for the next session, please. Thank you very much. Keep you all away from that pile of uneaten cheese and onion crisps, which are looking very sad out there. You talk about what people say they like and what they really like. I think that demonstrates that people don't really like cheese and onion. Right, I'm really looking forward to this next discussion. Some great guests here, as you see, and so I'm going to just hand over to the Editor-in-Chief, National World, who's going to be chairing it for us, and that's Mark Waldron. Mark.
Thank you very much, Richard. Yes, so I'm Mark Waldron. I'm an Editor-in-Chief at National World. Previous to that, I was editor in the News in Portsmouth for quite a number of years. And way back when, I was also a former reporter at the Whole Daily Mail. I don't know if Sian's still here. Luckily, it was in the days. It was very much in the days before we had a happy box. So I don't know what happened. I left and they bring in a happy box. So I don't know whether the two were linked. But also, I do a lot of work with the NCTJ as well. I sit on the accreditation board like Marie does, and a few of other friends around the room as well. So yeah, trying to support the NCTJ as much as I can do as well to put back into their training, what they gave me at the start. So this round table, it was set up as the reason was to explore the current landscape for court reporting, including the challenges faced by reporters on the ground and the role of the courts in supporting public access and transparency. And luckily I've got some experts who can talk through that, and I'll let them introduce themselves in a moment. But I do have Andrew Bardsley, who's the court reporter for the Manchester Evening News, Nick Frame, court reporter from the Yorkshire Evening Post, and Georgia Jerram, Director of Communications at HM Courts and Tribunals Service. I'll try and wrap up our discussion as early as I can do so we can have some room for questions, because I'm sure you all have various questions you might want to throw at the panel as well. But just to set the scene really, Richard did send me his book in advance of today. He said he'd make some good bedtime reading. Didn't manage to take it to bed with me, but I did read it up on the train yesterday. I think there's a few nuggets that I pull out of it. One is that court reporting maintains an importance as a central feature of open justice and public interest reporting. And I think we've heard a lot of that today about how vital and crucial court reporting is for democracy. There was a good good quote there from Lord Chief Justice Hewitt, who I didn't realise was a former journalist, saying, "Justice should not only be done, but should be manifestively and undoubtedly be seen to be done." And Richard's book goes through a lot of the many challenges that has put that into doubt, leaving the future of court reporting uncertain, whether that's reduction in budgets, reduction in court reporters, reduction in coverage, closure of courts, etc., etc. But shock news, court reporting is not dead. And you heard Maria earlier saying about her incredible stats of how many court stories they still do every week and what figures they drive. You might have seen a report at the time. Richard did his own survey of big three regional newspaper groups across the north and found that they did 180 court-related stories in a week. Richard says that court reporters are working harder and busier, so we'll hear about that in a moment, which helps probably mask the general decline in numbers. But he says court reporters now are more flexible, hard-working and visible than ever. So they're not part of a dying breed, but a breed that has withered. So without further ado, I would like to speak to my withering colleagues to the left. So if I start with you first, please, Andrew, if you just want to just introduce yourself and talk a bit about how you got into court reporting. I know Sian said she wants to have more people saying, I want to be a court reporter when I grow up. So was it always a lifetime ambition? How did you get into court reporting?
No, in a word. Similar to Sian, I just fell into it. I was a trainee reporter at the Bury Times, and it just so happened that Bolton Crown Court is just over the road, is 30 seconds walk from the Bury Times office, which is based at Bolton. So I went to Bolton Crown Court one day and I just sort of fell in love with court reporting and thought, yeah, that's what I fancy doing. You're out of the office, you're out of the editor's hair. you can make your own diary. You make your own diary. It's your day goes far quicker, and you hear some really interesting cases. You watch some brilliant lawyers in action, and I just sort of thought, yeah, that's what I want to do. And I moved on from the Bury Times to the Bolton News. And I've now been the MEN's court reporter for 7 years. And I primarily cover Manchester Crown Court, do a bit of Minchell Street. I've just spent 6 months doing the Rochdale grooming trial at Minchell Street. But yeah, probably the most famous court cases I've covered are Ryan Giggs's trial, Benjamin Mendy's trial in Chester. And I've covered every day of the Brenna Jai trial as well. So,
okay.
Yeah, I think it's to think about people who want to be in court reporters. I think it's the best job in the newsroom, and I think once people get that experience, I think they do enjoy it and they do want to take it on. And I think that is probably my positive note for the future.
Indeed, absolutely. And we'll come back in a moment on the challenge that or the changes that you've seen across your time in court reporting and what it takes to become a very good court reporter. But Nick, same question, how did you get into court reporting?
I think I just fell into it, like Andrew, really. But the crime thing has always been, I've always been interested in that anyway. And I think, well, doing court, why would anybody not want to do court? It's the easiest job to do in the newsroom, and you get the most interesting stories.
We'll do this down.
Yeah, you don't have to really do anything. I always say to people, they're like microwave stories. They're ready meals. They're there on a plate. Everything you need is in that room. So I've worked at the Evening Post for 3 years now, coming up 3 years. But I was covering court for Wakefield for 3 years before that, and I worked in Mansfield for quite a while and covered quite a bit of court there as well. So yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Georgie, you obviously see it very much from a different side of the fence. So can you tell us a bit about your role as communications lead director, and also a bit about what the HM Courts and Tribunal Service actually does? So if you can just explain that.
Sure,
for the
no
room,
problem.
please.
So HMCTS for short, His Majesty's Courts and Tribunal Service. It's actually an agency that's part of the Ministry of Justice. So I'm a civil servant, and everyone within HMCTS has a joint accountability to both the government and the independent judiciary. So we occupy quite a unique and challenging position at times. One of the things that I do is I chair something called the HMCTS Media Group. Sian is a member of it. Thank you. We have representation on there from the Crime Reporters Association, from BBC, Reach and Newsquest are represented on that group. And it's really a forum to bring together and understand the kind of operational nature of what happens on the front line. When you come into a court, how are you experiencing, accessing those hearings, those rooms, the information that you need, and how we can try and resolve some of that. We know it is challenging and we know it can be very inconsistent. But we have started to make some changes. I should probably add that HMCTS is the administrative function of the courts. So we are not making the policy, that's Ministry of Justice, and we do not speak on behalf of or make judicial decisions either, but we're about the administrative function of the courts.
And is that working group you talked about, how do you decide who sits on that working group?
So it's organically grown, but actually we have just had a little bit of a shift to make sure there is more representation from court reporters who are practicing. We have a couple of media lawyers on there as well, so the News Media Association and the Media Lawyers Association are also represented on it. But we reached out to some of the big groups, and we've got, so the people who represent Reach, for example, are managing editor, but also frontline court reporters who are sitting in courtrooms, experiencing what it's like every day.
Okay. I'm conscious here that, from the university and the NCTJ point of view, that very important that they know what's happening in courts and what you'd want to be expecting from journalists of the future. So is there room for training providers and...
There's definitely room for discussion and other forums and keeping this engagement going. That's what we're trying to do, certainly in between meetings, is make sure that we are opening this up. Actually, we've just had a bit of a refresh of the media working group, and one of the things we have asked its members to do is to reach out further into the wider reporting community. Absolutely would love to continue having conversations and doing things like that, so that we can keep.
And how, I know you said before that I think the 11th commandment of civil servants is thou shalt not talk to the media. So as Director of Communications, how do you manage to put those two sides of the coin together?
Well, of course there are means and ways which we can talk to the media through press office, but in terms of observation and your ability to access information, which is different really from my role as communication, which is sort of giving a narrative around the justice system, it's wearing a slightly different hat, and it's about enabling you to give the narrative of what you see and observe. But when we were talking earlier, we know that you can experience really significant inconsistency when you come into our courts and you interact with one of my colleagues. And there's this kind of cultural unease and something that we're trying to address through education and training, engagement with our people. But if you look at the Civil Service Code of Conduct, it basically says don't ever speak to a journalist. And then we ask the most junior people in our organisation, our admin assistants, and we're saying to them, you give them everything. You know, that's your starting point. You give them everything, and they're sort of like, you know, it's a challenge.
Can I ask a quick question? Sorry.
Sure.
In your media representative group, how many representatives are from different communities of colour?
I don't know off the top of my head, but they're representative of journalists rather than. I don't recall any, but I can have a look and tell you.
Okay, thank you. So how do you guys find your relationships day to day with dealing with the courts, getting access to records, trying to get in remotely to hearings? How do you find that relationship works with the court service? Nick, if I come to you first one.
It varies. You know, you can go into a court, some ushers welcoming, they'll want you in there, they'll nudge you, say there's a good one in court 3, you know, that kind of thing. Same with the clerks, some will happily give you the details, some of them just rabbit in the headlights when you ask them, you know, they don't want to talk to you. And so I was talking to somebody from PA the other week when we were waiting outside a courtroom, and they said they feel like at the bottom of the food chain, and it does feel like that sometimes, you know, more than the defendants, which is, you think it's a pretty low place to go. But yeah, you sometimes do feel like that, and barristers, some will talk to you, some won't. It just, like I say, it varies, and especially on the CVP, the link, the live stream link, some clerks will happily email you and say it's been switched to court 12, or you know, or they'll give you details. If you didn't know already, it's so and so who's prosecuting, and so and so who's defending. While others will just not talk to you at all. In terms of details, phoning in. The Crown Court Leeds Crown Court particularly they're very helpful. They'll give you any detail when you ring them up and talk to the desk. I think they've all been told that they have to, you know, just give them what they want, like you said. The magistrates not so much anymore. I think not that I ring the magistrates that much anymore, but I think there's now a centralised number. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Because they won't, which I think I hit the roof when I first rang up when I was told that. I said, "What? You're not going to give me the details?" Try ringing this number, which didn't. It just rang out. Nobody picked up, so it wasn't particularly helpful. So yeah, it varies day to day, moods. Mondays, come Fridays, depends on
Depends if you're in the court with the grumpy usher.
Yeah, exactly.
Don't know where they use. What about you, Andrew?
I'd say generally very good. I've been at Crown Square, Manchester for 7 years, and I think it's about building relationships with people. I think if someone walks into the court and the clerk or the usher doesn't know who you are, there's a natural and understandable standoffishness about who's this person, and they're worrying they might get in trouble if they hand over information, you know, and they use it in a way that they're not supposed to or something. But I have really good relationships with most of the clerks. There's quite a high turnover of clerks at the moment though, so I've spent a bit of time at Minchester and I've come back and I don't really recognise anyone anymore. But yeah, I think it's just about, as with any kind of journalism job, it's building relationships with people and getting that trust, and that's why getting experience as a court reporter is so important, because I do feel sorry for trainees sometimes who go into court and it can be bewildering and terrifying. I remember as a trainee, I didn't even know where to sit in the court. You know, once I found somewhere to sit, that was something to build on them. And then, you know,
Start from there. Yeah.
And then the next thing was trying to get the courage to actually go and speak to a barrister. And you know, it can be quite a terrifying experience, but once you get there, and you know, then you can just sort of build it, and it's just about building up trust and relationships with people, I think.
Okay. So that's sorry.
I was just going to say that somebody touched on it before. What the magistrates, I think, is the place where you get. Well, you see a lot on social media about what's happening in magistrates, where the ushers don't really know how to handle us. You know, they want ID, or they want to ask the judge, or the magistrate. The district judge sometimes, you know, if we're allowed to take notes and this kind of thing. I think it's just simply because there's so few journalists now covering the magistrates that they don't know what to do with. Sometimes you just feel like, you know, quoting chapter and verse, you know, from McNair's about, you know, we are allowed to report on this. But yeah, especially, but like Andrew said, if you're a junior reporter and you're not used to it, then you'll just do what they say. Whereas if you've got a bit of experience, you can at least challenge them. You know, so it's difficult.
And we know that, and you should challenge them. And you know, we have media guidance published on our website for our staff in our name that you can point to and say, you know, it gives them that reassurance. But we do know that's a challenge, and I think you're right. Part of the issue is that when you go outside of the big urban centres in particular, some of them have never met a journalist, and they're frightened of it. They're frightened of that interaction. It doesn't make it right, but it's definitely something we're working on in terms of training and trying to get people more confident.
And I think obviously there's two things there, that training on your side, but the fact that we're not going out there means that they're not exposed to that on a daily basis, so it probably does erode after time. So it's good. I mean, so you know, media training, use of McNays, contact, making relationships, those things haven't changed, and it's good to see that. But what has been the biggest change that you've seen in the way you do your job in the time that you've been doing it, Andrew?
Well, the actual nature of court reporting has not changed very much. I think Sian said it before. It's, you know, it's getting this court, it's taking notes, it's getting your notes down, but it's the output that's different. It's you know, when I started, I'd be doing a 400-word page lead, and that'd be me for the day. Yeah. But now it's all those days. I'd love to go back to those.
Still not the same. Okay.
You know, it'd be if there's a police press conference outside after, it's going outside doing Facebook Live. It's doing a live blog during the sentencing. It's trying to combine, when you're doing that live blog, it's trying to get your shorthand down and take a minute's notice to type something up without getting drowned in notes. It's taking, I don't really do this, to be honest, but it's maybe taking snatch pictures outside. It's just, there's so many different ways, and there's so many different ways of sort of backgrounders. You need your traditional backgrounder, and then the desk will want 3 different backgrounders that Richard knows in my book when we were talking about Brianna Jai trial. I'd written 3 backgrounders for the end of the trial, and they just used them all that night, and then they wanted 3 more, so I had to conjure up from them from somewhere. But
which is still here.
Yeah. So it's just it's the web. It's the, you know, it's the place that will never be filled. You can't fill up. You can fill up paper, but you can't fill up the web. So
no.
It's just so many different ways you're expected to, your journalism is expected to obviously be presented, and that's obviously the big change for myself.
What about you, Nick?
Well, I think I mentioned before, the CVP, the cloud video platform, the live stream has been just the game changer for us at Leeds, because there's so many courts in Leeds. There's 14 courts with between 8 and 10 cases each day. You know, so masses of cases going on at the same time. But what I can do, and what I've become quite adept at, is opening maybe 5 courts at once, and I can sometimes take 2 or 3 cases down at the same time. Providing they don't all start at the same time, you know, you have to have a few minutes gap between them. You know, because you get a feel for how court works. So, you know, there's a lull for a few minutes where they talk about sentencing guidelines, which nobody wants to hear about, apart from the judge. So you can just volume down on that, volume up on the next one, and then just, you know, and do that. So I think in terms of the way you write the stories, it hasn't changed. But the amount of headlines you have to write has definitely changed. I think I have to put 5 headlines for each story now. With your SEO, I still don't even know what that means. And you've got your URL one, and you've got your social media one, and so there's that. And I think the pace in which you have to turn stories around now has changed. Like Andrew said, I think I've only worked in the digital age myself anyway. Really, in terms of court. But I can't imagine that they were expected to do as much as what we do now. I have to turn around 3 stories a day, 3 sentences a day. Which when I first started, I thought, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do this, but I can sometimes get 9 in the morning. You know, just from the 5 courts that I've got open. You know, close one, open another, that kind of thing. So that's changed. And like you say, it used to be a case of you have to listen and write at the same time. Well, now you have to listen, write, and type at the same time on some occasions. So that's changed. I suppose it's the same as, you know, everyone's trying to get the story out first. It's like the old films you see everyone rushing out to the nearest payphone to, you know, phone it in. There's that. But I think by and large, the style in which you write the story, it just doesn't change, and you're probably given a bit more creative freedom because there's no, you know, there's no sub-editor shouting that you need another 5 pars or you need to chop it by 5 pars or that kind of thing.
So it has some benefits then.
It definitely does. Yeah.
And what about you, have you seen much of the change? So like with the working group and the type of things that you're getting asked about, and provision at courts, and
so I think remote hearings has been the most significant change in terms of the experience of courts in their entirety. I mean, it's more resource intensive for us to set up a CVP link than not.
Yeah.
So there's an immediate shift in what we're needing to do and how we need to service that to get you a link, for you to make a request for a CVP link. If a list comes out at 5 o'clock, it's a judicial decision. That decision has to go before the judge. We need to get back, get you a link. You know, we know that's not always as smooth as we would like it to be. But I guess it's just that contextual understanding of actually it's much more resource intensive for us to service that than it was in the past. I think one of the biggest changes for us is kind of in line with that actually, is about digitalisation of our systems. And that's really an infrastructure issue for HMCTS. But it fundamentally changes how our back-end systems work and where our staff are and what they're doing. So the admin person that you might have contacted in the magistrates court is no longer there. We have centralised service centres, which then leads on to having a centralised telephone line, which, you know, we're trying to get working better. But we will see more of that, and that's a change in ways of working for us, and it will be a change in ways of working for you as well. But I think that digitalising many of those systems, not all of them, it's still a quite fragmented picture, does give a platform for greater consistency in the future. For the first time, we will have data that we do not have now. We don't know how many times you're turning up to court. We don't know how many times you're asking for a CVP link. We don't know how bad we are at answering the phone or not, because it's all managed in a really, or had been in a really fragmented way. So now that some of that centralisation is in place, I think there is a platform to start improving and building, but I think you will still experience changes in the way that we work and changes in the way that you interact with us as well.
Can I ask a question about the CVP? Is that all right? Sorry to,
No.
it's really interesting because do you find that judges are resistant to CVPs? Because you'll often get kind of barristers chatting, and you can hear them saying the judge doesn't want to give ours, what they think it should be.
Yeah.
And I wonder what it's like at your end.
So, you go.
Ryan, or-
Actually, do you know what? This is a slightly more difficult question for me to answer, being a civil servant and do not speak on the public judiciary. So I think it's just patchy. I think it's inconsistent.
Yeah.
I don't think there's anything more sort of organised or Machiavellian than that. I think it's just that independence. And
But
then
is the policy that they should be done? They should be allowed if they are available?
it's entirely their decision, but they do have part of that decision making. There is a practice direction that relates to it, and part of that decision is about, are the resources available, what are the parties, who is asking. So there are, and it always has to be, their default position is in the interest of justice. Is it in the interest of justice to allow this to happen on CVP? But it is inconsistent, and that is quite difficult to service as well, right? We're trying to service out on the other end.
How could it not be in the interest of justice, though?
I'm not going to answer on behalf of the independent judiciary.
Makes no sense.
Nick, were you going to jump in on that?
I was, yeah, just so that we do have issues with some judges. I applied for a case at Teesside Crown Court the other week with a monk who had sexually abused a pupil at Ampleforth. And I was told that I could be in the CVP for the opening of the case, but not for the defence. So I said, this is ridiculous. This is absolutely... So I sent this a snotty email back saying, you can't do this, I need to, I can't, And they never sent me an email back, but then just let me in for the whole case. So I don't know if someone is a cock-up somewhere down the line, but I have heard that from the top judge in Leeds, recorder Guy Curl, who said that some at the top of the judiciary are not happy about it. They don't want it, they want to get rid of it, which would just make my job, and especially those who cover Leeds Crown Court, infinitely more difficult.
Thanks, Nick. We had a really fascinating session earlier about cameras in court. Is that something that's actively being pursued as how far you think you can take that for the future? Or is...
It's less in my bailiwick, but I'm aware that the judges are talking about it, I think, on the Transparency Board, and I think there would need to be further legislation to enable it in different courts and different jurisdictions. So it's definitely a topic of conversation, but sort of slightly outside my...
I just said one other thing. I mean, you've talked quite positively about the steps you're taking to make life easier. Is there anything driving that apart from the need for open justice?
So I think there is the need for open justice. I think we are wholly committed to it. So in HMCTS, we are utterly committed to it as a principle. Translating that into operational reality is challenging and difficult. I think the new Judicial Transparency Board is definitely helpful, because I think we can't influence all of these actors in it. You know, we don't have judges act independently, and certainly we don't have direction over them. They have direction over us. So I think that is a really helpful movement by the current Lady Chief Justice. And I think if Matthew Nicklin, who chairs that board, heard your example of being, allowed to attend part and not the other, again, I can't speak on behalf of the judges. Everyone heard me say it. I think he'd be horrified. I really
hope
do.
so. Yeah.
I really do.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for that. Just changing subject now for a while, and it was again raised one of the conversations this morning about the emotional toil that covering court day in day out can have on you as reporters. I think Sian talked about trauma therapy. I think there's two sides to it. One is the physical challenges of you're there reporting courts of people who don't want you to be reporting on it, but just that day in day out of bad news after bad news. How do you cope with that? Have you had to change? Do you get any support from your newsrooms and your bosses to make sure that you're okay?
I've not seen any direct support. It's easy to say, but you just have to try and switch off and just when you walk out of that courtroom, just think, right, that's that's me done for the day. I'm thinking about the rest of my day then.
Mm-hmm.
It's not easy. It's gonna have an effect on you. I'm sure part of my brain is missing that that was there before, but it'll come out in some point in the future, I guess, probably. But you just got to try and be a professional and just think, I'm doing a job here. Think of you can't be human without thinking, feeling emotion for people who are going through such terrible things. But at the end of the day, you're doing your job, and we've heard how important that job is. And you just got to think, as emotional as it might be, I've just got to think of what I'm doing. Really, I don't think you can do much more than that, to be honest.
And do you get much trolling?
I've only really had one incident where it got fairly serious, and I was a bit worried. It was just this lad who turned up to court, and he was very naive about the whole process. And he'd come in his work uniform, and we'd done a snatch picture of him, and he'd assaulted his girlfriend on a night out. Not a very bad incident, but not something that's going to catch the world on fire in terms of news. But then he'd lost his job. He'd not told his employers. He then lost his job, and his world came crashing around, and that was all my fault, of course. And then threats were made, and I had to spend a few days not at court because he obviously knew where I was, and there was some intelligence that he liked using weapons and stuff like that. So just as a precaution, but you get stuff online, but it don't really bother me, to be honest. It's people online, and they can say things, and whether they'll actually do anything, it's still the matter, isn't it? But as a rule, I think female journalists get it a lot worse than male journalists, to be honest. I've got colleagues who, female colleagues who get a lot worse, and I think it is quite misogynistic in that way. A lot of people online, obviously, that's a big issue anyway in society, but I think it is an issue when the abuse of journalists, definitely.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Nick, same question to you.
When it comes to the switching off, it's never bothered me really. I don't know if I've got something missing, but it's not. I live on a daily diet of death and depravity, and it's and I enjoy it. So, what can I say? But I think there are some issues around that. Safety issues, like Andrew said there about going to court, especially where the Leeds Crown, where I work, basically the press bench is the front bench of the public gallery. And because we're all sat there with laptops open now, you've got the mother of the defendant or the victim behind you watching you type, and that kind of thing. It riles people up, obviously. Because everyone's want to get the story out first. So we've got three of us sat there all typing. Not only does it make a lot more noise, which puts people off, but they know exactly they can see exactly what you're writing, which is not good. I personally, I think that barristers should be making defendants aware that the press could be in the room, because the amount of complaints we get, not to me, my number's been taken off the website, thank you for that. But the amount of people who they're absolutely shocked. They have no idea that we could do this. But nobody tells them. Nobody in the court, nobody probation, no barrister. Nobody's telling them it. This could end up in lights. So. So I think more needs to be done to that, just to soften the blow a little bit, at least.
Okay. All right. Just conscious of time, so just moving on to another question. And you've already touched on some of this. So the skills that you need, which I think is covering 5 courts, and writing and typing and changing the mute volumes with your toes or whatever.
Yeah.
Writing different headlines. For the trainers in the room, what would be your one advice to what would make someone a good court reporter?
Well, there's shorthand, obviously.
Shorthand.
Yeah, that's invaluable. Anytime I bump into any students, I'll tell them, just get the shorthand. Doesn't matter if you fail anything else, just get the shorthand. You can't cram a shorthand exam. It's just impossible.
Yeah.
But just practice. You just have to go and just be there day in, day out. You get a feel for what you... Because I think a lot of students tend to think that you need to write everything down, every last detail that everybody says in court down, where obviously you don't. You just get a feel for what's valuable and what you can just jettison. So yeah, just be in court, just get used to it and just practice and just take down the notes and write the story and just do that day in, day out, and that's the only way you can do it, I think.
So even with laptops in court and different ways of recording what's happening, shorthand still very much.
It's just you can't. I get pulled up even now. I edit a weekly. It says, "Have you still got your pad from October last year?" I said, "Yeah." So, well, can you dig it out? We've got a query on a case. It's like, I don't know why it's taken them 8 months to get around to actually complaining about it. And it's never let me down. It's there. It's in black and white, and they can't challenge it. Because the defendants or defence families will always say that's a lie. So, well, I didn't make it up. It's there. It's obviously said, but it might not be true, but it's been said by the Crown or the defence. So, we're covered.
Okay. Andrew, anything you'd add to that?
In addition to the actual skill, I just think you've just got to be able to talk to people, and you've got to build relationships with people. Being able to speak to the grieving mother and father of a deceased child and stuff, and you've just got to be sensitive and you want to get your story out there, but you want to do it in a sensitive way, and a way that'll get you they'll be able to trust you and sort of build up that relationship. And it's over the many years I've been doing it, your physical job gets so much easier once you've built up that trust and relationship with people, with police officers, with judges, with barristers. It just makes your job so much easier. And the writing is just the easiest bit of the day. The writing is like the 5% of the day. It's the getting the story and building those relationships, and that I find is the most rewarding and it's the best bit of the job, really. Yeah,
that's good. Some things never change. So the final question from myself, thinking about the future. I'll start with you, Georgia. If you could make one change to the way that you as a court service work with journalists and the media to make life better moving forward, what would you like to change? What would you like to see happen?
Consistency. And we think, hope, believe that centralisation will help us to do that. It's not all there, because I don't know if you can centralise some bits but not the others, so they're not entirely central, but trying to give you timely, accurate responses that meet your needs, which, the needs of a newsroom are not the same as the needs of a courtroom, but being able to do that consistently in a timely and efficient way. So it's one call, the right information, first time. That's where we would love to get to. That will be a game changer for us and a game changer for you. Some of the stepping stones are in place to do that, and we're going to keep trying to work hard on that to make that better.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we'd all agree with that. Anything else, Nick? What else would you?
I don't know. Apart from, like I say, the consistency is something that gets me really. Everything else you can pretty much do yourself. But it's just the consistency from one judge or one clerk or one court centre to another. That inconsistency is just, it needs ironing out really. So that's about the only thing that I would push for.
Andrew?
I've always been banging on this ever since I started, and I've mentioned it to George before, and she says it may be on the way. So that's my.
I'm going to have to do some expectation management. Go on.
Getting access to the digital case system, because even yesterday I was sat in a murder trial and they were talking about the sequence of events in the trial, which I do not have a copy of, and they go into line 870. Can you just read that out? And all right, I don't know what you're talking about, but it sounds interesting, but I don't know what you're talking about. But you know, I'm sure it's, like you said, it's probably easy to do, but you just want the Americans have it already. You have one centralised system where you get the indictment, you get the prosecution's opening, copies of report and restrictions, and when the judge's sentencing is finished, maybe you can upload that as well, or he or she obviously. And it's just, you at the moment you're relying on goodwill off barristers and clerks who know that you need that to get your story over the line, because unless you've got a copy of the report and restriction, your lawyer won't touch it, you know, because they don't know what we can and can't say, because it's not there in black and white. So that'll just make everything so much easier.
Come back on that.
Yeah, if you
just
can,
briefly,
yeah, absolutely.
with a big caveat of it's not coming tomorrow. But so as part of building digital systems, we have something called the Courts and Tribunals Hearings Service, which is basically an online portal that has the potential to house many of the documents that you're talking about. So we currently are, so single justice procedure lists, for example, are currently produced in there. Actually, we've got a webinar tomorrow about moving the Royal Courts of Justice lists so that you can view them in there. And that portal has different personas that you can register as. So you can register as a journalist, and that will give you access to the information that is intended for you. It's in quite narrow use at the moment. It has the potential to house a lot more. To house more, it needs the rest of the system to be digitalised, to connect. It needs investment, it needs to be a priority, it needs money, it needs resources. So the sort of seeds are there, and you know, it'd be part of that bigger consistency package. You know, I don't know if and when we will get there, but it's not impossible.
And the will's
and it's
there.
in the mind of the minds of
Okay.
people to try and make it work.
All right, thanks a lot for that, Georgia. We've had some questions, good questions so far. Richard, I don't know if you want to open the floor to more questions. We've got 2 minutes maybe.
Yeah, why not?
Any-
Here we go.
I've noticed that there's more court stories now being based on police press releases. I just wonder what your opinion was of this.
It's not ideal, but you know, police press releases often based on the police's summary of the case, and that, you know, that might have been proved to, you know, be untrue or not backed up by evidence. And I mean, yeah, it's a good tool for if you're not at a case or if you miss a case, but yeah, ideally you don't want to be using them. You know, it's a good, you know, for if you want to quote off the police or something like that, but for the factual nitty-gritty of the case, it's not ideal, is it? It's you don't want to be relying on it as your main thing if you're on a big story, but it's a tool for the lesser stories perhaps that you wouldn't get to otherwise.
Yeah, it seems to be mainly for sentencing, and then so they put out a bit of copy and a mugshot, and you see this used all the time now. Whereas a few years ago that didn't seem to be the case, but now it seems to be quite common.
Yeah, I mean, especially for papers that can't get to court as much as they'd like to, and sure, it's a good tool, but it's not ideal. You don't get the mitigation from the defence. You don't get the information that will contextualise something, and you often get complaints of people saying, you know, this hasn't been said. Well, you know, you've got the legal protection of it being a police press release, so you know you're using their goodwill that they've put in the correct information, but you can't. Yeah, it's not ideal, but that's the police's PR team.
Thanks. Richard?
Yeah, there's loads here. One or two more,
Yeah, yeah.
There's two over there, so hang on.
Oh my God.
Oh,
That would have been really embarrassing. Okay, so my question's sort of touching on something that you've already spoken about, Mark, but it's to do with the trolling. So I'm from the University of Sheffield, and part of what we do is try and prepare our students for the realities of how difficult it is to get abuse, especially online. As part of one of my first year lectures, Nick actually really helpfully provided me with a real video message that someone had sent to the Yorkshire Evening Post of a very angry man calling Nick a C word and a paedophile regarding a story that he had written. Now, we thought that was hilarious, and so I played it to the first years, and then I lost 30% of them to philosophy. So I scared the absolute crap out of them by showing them the realities of it. But it is something that's really, really important to prepare them for. Where's the line between terrifying our potential next generation of court reporters and actually making sure they're aware of the kind of abuse you can get?
Yeah. I mean, I'll come in on that one as an editorial manager, that you're right. I think we have a duty to let students know that life can be tough out there, and that it's not a nice world, and you do need a tough skin. But I think we can't just think, well, that's acceptable, that's part of the job. So just grow up and get used to it, because that's not right either. And I think we are, as newsrooms and newsroom managers, we are becoming more and more attuned to the fact that we have a responsibility to prepare people for that, but also look after them. So I was slightly nervous when it was like, well, it's just what we do, and if we get a load of abuse, well, that's it, because we shouldn't be in that situation. But I think it's trying to get that balance right of the realities of the world, but also making sure we're not just throwing people out there and not looking after them. And I'd hope that we do that. There was
a quick plea to your department. There is going to be a time when we will want our students to observe family courts, because you can read about it, you won't be able to experience it, what it's like in there, unless you go in there. So a plea to you to sort of start those discussions where we can take students, trainee journalists, into family courts, please.
I suspect it's one for the judiciary, but I'll happily feed it back to Olive.
okay. Okay. Well, I'd just like to thank.
Was there one at the back?
Well, it's up to
Sorry.
you, Richie. Whether
Yeah, go on.
Okay.
Okay, this is my
Chuck it back to
basketball
John.
ready.
Go on, John. Yay!
Thanks. Can we just have a bit of consistency about whether trainee journalists are allowed to take notes in court, please? It just comes up every single time I take the students to Leeds Crown Court. Even though Guy Curl has sent, an email around to everyone saying it is allowed, we're still not getting any consistency. Depending on which courtroom you're in, students can or cannot take notes. And just very briefly, on the regurgitating police press releases, it's just occurred to me, if you do that, you're not actually covered by the protection of the Contempt of Court Act, are you? Because it's not an accurate an accurate report of court proceedings. So that just occurred to me.
I'll just come back on the student note.
Yeah, just on the student.
I'm just going to come back on student
Yeah,
notes.
yeah.
And I'll pick it up with Leeds. But as you know, they are entitled to take notes. It is written in our staff guidance, which is published on gov.uk in our name. That is us saying students can take notes. So please do feel free to point my colleagues towards that when you come up with those
Will do,
challenges.
thanks.
But I'll pick it up.
I print out a copy.
Wave it.
I wave it.
Excellent.
I had it battered away. I don't care what your piece of paper says.
It's our piece of
And I
paper.
said, this is your piece
Yes,
of paper.
exactly.
And it was highlighted. And not only does it say, journalists can come in and we don't need to police them if they make a mistake. It says they're professionals. And I'm like, we're professionals. It says if they make a mistake, they'll get dealt with. It's not up to an usher to prevent them from. And then it says student journalists, we should be encouraging them to learn. We want more court reporting. We want open justice. The document says it, and I've argued with ushers and the district judge over it, and left it with them. And then the next time I've gone, when they've actually read it, there's been a different reception. But that 5 or 6 pieces of paper printed out and yellow highlighter. But every time I go in, I have to take it.
Sorry, yeah. I'm sorry you've had those experiences, but thank you for...
So it's a brilliant piece of paper.
Okay. Thank you very much, John. I'd just like to thank my panel. I think we've shown that we've got two absolutely fantastic proponents of the art of court reporting. How you cope with your day-to-day and the demands on you by your news desk is quite frightening. But, from our industry's point of view, how do we get more like you, which is tough. I think I've heard some positive noise from the court service that you are trying to make things better. Inconsistency seems to be the big thing. But I'd just like to round of applause for all the guests today.
Fantastic. Thanks, everyone. There's some more tea and coffee has turned up outside, so we'll start again at 3 o'clock, please. 3 o'clock.
Your wet nose.
That was great. right, thank you, everyone. So we've got a couple more great sessions to go this afternoon. And for the next one, they're going to focus really on themes around training and teaching in court reporting and themes and topics related to that. So for the next session, I'm delighted to hand you over to Sandra Loy from Cardiff University. Sandra.
Thank you very much. Hello. Thank you, Richard, for this wonderful day. I think the phrase as happy as a pig in muck applies to me today. So it's been delightful. Thank you. Brief introduction from me. I'm Sandra Loy, Cardiff University. I teach the news journalism MA. I also also do a lot of work with the NCTJ, the glorious organisation that is the NCTJ, and thank you to you guys for having me here today. So I have a role on the law board and on the shorthand board, and I'm sure we may well want to talk about shorthand in a little while. That's all you need to know about me. We have 5 excellent people here today. Now, the majority are going to be talking about teaching court reporting, and there will be regular themes coming up about preparing students for courts, as we've heard. You might also hear about a few grumpy ushers as well. They may well feature. We've had a late change to the lineup. Caroline has very kindly stepped in. You've literally jetted in, I think, haven't you? So most of you will be talking about teaching court reporting. Caroline's will be a bit different, and you're going to go last, aren't you, because you don't have a specific presentation. So that's how it's going to work. We think we've agreed that we will all stick to time, and we'll do questions at the end. So if you're happy to do it that way, then that's how it will work. So I'm going to hand, first of all, over then to Polly Rippon and Lisa Bradley from University of Sheffield. Right one's up, isn't it? Yeah. I'll get out of the way.
We good? Yeah. Sorry guys, it's 3 o'clock and everyone's just thinking about the pub now, aren't they? So I'm also going to say this is my 7th cup of coffee and I speak really quick normally, so I'm sorry if this is going to sound like I'm on speed. But hi, thanks very much for having us. It's nice to see lots of familiar faces. I have spoken on the topic of trauma and resilience at quite a few conferences and for the NCTJ. So sorry that you have to listen to me drone on about it again. But my job at the moment is I'm head of undergraduate journalism at the University of Sheffield. I am also on the accreditation board of the NCTJ and the safety and resilience board as well. And I'm the co-editor of the book Journalism as the Fourth Emergency Service, which is a textbook on how to teach trauma and resilience training to journalists. This is my amazing colleague Polly, who will be taking over as head of undergraduate journalism in September, and is an award-winning, because she won't say it herself, media law and court reporting teacher too. So we're here to talk about our journey in preparing students for the realities of court reporting, and I'm just going to give you a little bit of context as to why we felt this was a really important thing to introduce into our curriculum. As I'm sure that you are all very aware, the next generation, and when I'm talking about this generation, we're talking about 18 to 24-year-olds, are completely different and cut from a different cloth to what we all are. And it may be that you want to call them snowflakes or woke or whatever you want to say. You might want to tell them to man up, woman up, non-binary up, whatever. However, their reality is very, very different to ours. And we have found through our work with these students that they do not have the same tools and coping mechanisms that perhaps we have done when learning how to deal with not only distressing content and explicit material, but also confidence, imposter syndrome, and even picking up a phone and being able to actually do some basic life skills. There's a huge argument to say that this is not our job as lecturers to be able to teach them these skills, but we did find that this is a direct threat to the future of court reporting if students continue to refuse to go to court cases because they are triggered by the emotional content. So what Polly and I have looked at is how we build this resilience skills, not only about how to report brilliant stories from court, but actually how to make sure that they're not going to say that to editors, we were getting feedback from editors as well, that students were too nervous to go, or young journalists in their first job, early career journalists, were too nervous to actually go to court because they didn't want to hear anything that was going to upset them. And also, like I said in the previous panel, the fear of the cyber sort of trolling, and just in general because they are terrified of being in a formal environment and outside of their comfort zone. There's lots of reasons why this generation is the most anxious generation, and Jonathan Haidt has written an amazing book that I fully recommend called The Anxious Generation. And his findings as part of this, there's some really stark figures, I'll really quickly go through them. This is from last year, 1 in 3 18 to 24-year-olds in the UK report to have an anxiety or depression diagnosis. More than 250,000 teenagers are on the CAMHS waiting list, which is access to mental health support. In 2024, 28% of secondary school children stayed off school due to anxiety in the UK. And 100,000 teenagers were admitted to hospital due to self-harm. There's lots of theories to why our young people aren't able to cope as well with life. The main 3 reasons that the research says is, 1, because they are the first generation to have grown up entirely, and in particular go through puberty, with an alternative portal to the universe in their pocket. And social media has created a devastating effect on their development in their formative years and on their mental health. Secondly, COVID and the fact that they weren't able to socialise properly and develop those skills has had a massive long-lasting impact. And the third one, and this is a rabbit hole, so we'll just say it really quickly, is parenting. Parenting shifts. I will say it myself, I have 2 teenage sons. There's a lot of research that says that parents today are not teaching their children how to fail. So they do not teach them that everyone doesn't get a trophy for taking part. They do not teach them that it's okay to make mistakes, but it's how you pick yourself up afterwards. They do not teach them how to be confident. And I'm probably guilty of that as anyone, but it is actually a shift and apparently a contribution to it. So we can sit there and tell our students that they need to be tougher, that they need to understand that the world doesn't work like that, but this is actually the reality that they face. This is their world, and we have to recognise that. And to a certain extent, they recognise it themselves. Our students have asked us to support them, asked us to help them, and asked them to help them grow in confidence, because they don't want to go through life having this sort of fear of the real world. So as part of what we've done, is a sort of segue into second year where we teach our court reporting. And another prompt for this was some of our students began to complain that in media law exams there were questions to do with the Sex Offences Act which triggered them. Therefore they felt that they were too upset to answer the question, failed the exam, then we've got an appeal. It's a lot of paperwork. It's also not setting them up for life either, is it? And it's certainly not setting them up to sit in a courtroom and listen to these details and these experiences. We don't believe that we should change our assessment. We don't believe that we can shield them for the realities of what this job actually is, but it is our job to prepare them for it. So in first year, we've started doing all kinds of different things, such as using VR headsets to do simulated death knocks and crime scene investigations. We do coaching sessions on imposter syndrome and confidence building skills. We do a lot on a trauma-informed approach. And actually what we have found, one of the biggest things that has worked for us is explaining to our students why court reporting is so important, why it's so important to have justice to be seen to be done, why it's so important to actually give victims a voice. And if they refuse to do it because they feel triggered, they're stopping those stories from being heard. So that was what we do in first year. Moving into second year, where we do send them obviously out to court at Sheffield. Polly obviously takes them. She's done lots of work with getting judges to speak to the students, but before they even set foot in a courtroom, that anxiety and that stress is very, very real to them. So what we decided to do was convince the university to give us some money, which was the hardest thing in the entire project. And we wrote a mock court trial, which we heard earlier. The trial we've actually linked up with our law department. We actually have a courtroom at the University of Sheffield. We got some budget. We hired professional actors. I'm very lucky. My best friend's on Corrie, so she did it very cheaply for me. And Polly created this amazing experience for our students. She wrote the script based on one of the cases that she did herself, and I'll let her take over and explain how it works and the impact that it's had.
Hi everyone. Our second year students, in their first semester, they do their media law, and then court reporting comes in the second semester of year 2. So they're not first years, they're second years. I know different universities do the media law, some do it in first year, but we do it in the second year, so they're a little bit older.
So what they used to do in court reporting before COVID was they'd have 2 or 3 weeks of tuition in the classroom, and then they'd be told, bugger off to court and get some stories, and that was it. And after COVID, we found that this approach, we got feedback, a formal feedback from the students who said, we don't feel ready to go to court. We don't feel as if we can cope with some of the content we're hearing, the people that we're meeting in the public gallery. We feel like we need some more preparation. So I approached the law department to see whether we could work with them. In the end, I ended up coming to Lisa and saying, what can we do? And I said, you know, I've got an idea. And we were like, well, why don't we do a play, stage a play? So that's what we do. And we do the play in week 3. I'm going to show you a clip of it in a minute, hopefully. And then before they actually go to court, they have a guided tour of Sheffield Crown Court. We have a very friendly judge who comes down and speaks to them. The court clerk brings them in, shows them around the courtroom, tells them prosecutor sits there, defence is there, jury's there. That's where the defendant goes. They come in through that door. They normally go out through that door down to the cells. And so I think they just feel like they have a better understanding before they go for the first time of how the court is set up. We don't have that at magistrates yet. We're working on it. Same with inquests, because they do cover inquests as well. So for their assessment, they have to go down to court. We have over 100 students on this module. Although, no, actually, it's less now, isn't it?
No, it's more because we've got the MAs as well.
Yeah, so, right. So we have a high number of students, which means I can't go with them all, basically. They're on their own. So they go in small groups. And they go to Crown Court, trial openings and sentences. They go to magistrates, trial openings and sentences, and they go to inquest, where it's a full inquest and they're going to get a verdict so that they've got a story. And they have to put together a portfolio of 3 stories. That's their assessment. And then they sit an accuracy test, which is a separate thing where they listen to a made-up speech, they take a note in shorthand or longhand, it's read at 60 words a minute, and then they write a court story. So that's how the module is assessed. So this is the mock
It can sound
trial.
like a footstep on the path, and then suddenly I just felt like a hand grabbed me around the neck and I was choking, and I tried to turn around, but it was the man that was by the car. He had just evil eyes, and he just looked at me and told me to shut up.
So I was a court reporter at the Sheffield Star for many years, and this is actually a kind of mocked up version of a case that I covered, which was a cold case review. And so it's a rape case. It's the prosecution opening of a rape trial. Excuse the wigs, they were from Amazon. University wouldn't run to proper barrister's wigs, so we had to go with the fancy dress numbers. The law department had the black gown, so that was good. So we told them that it was going to be a rape trial and that there would be graphic content in there. We told them by email and in class. We didn't want anyone to say that we hadn't warned them. We didn't censor the material, so the prosecution opening is based on the original prosecution opening. There is detail about how the sexual assault happened. It's very explicit. We tried to make it as realistic as we could. The victim, so the prosecution open, and then the victim gives her evidence in chief and is cross-examined by the defence barrister, who's pretty nasty to her, probably wouldn't get away with the things that they ask her in court these days. And then that's it, it's 50 minutes. So during the course of the proceedings, we have a hysterical woman in the public gallery who shouts out. She's just kind of planted in next to the students, so they get a bit of a surprise when she starts ranting and swearing. And then she is escorted from the courtroom, and that's the end. So it's a 50-minute kind of play. We then give them a little bit of time to decompress. And then we have a bit of a chat. So we've done it for 3 years. I think the first year we had health and well-being professionals from the university come in and talk about self-care. The feedback we got was that it wasn't really journalism specific. So we scrapped that, and then Lisa and I basically just had a bit of a chat with them. And some of the questions that we talked about were things like, you know, what's the angle? This is a journalism class after all. What are the legal issues? Obviously, a sexual offences case. What did you think of the level of detail that you heard? And we had to explain, you know, the detail has to be tested. You have to be able to know whether the victim is telling the truth or not. What did they think of the level of detail? And then they asked us questions, didn't they, about approaching victims for interviews. How would we do that? What happens if we're sitting in the public gallery and we've got the family sitting next to us or behind us? So we sort of dealt with some of those kind of scenarios. And then we just gave them advice on getting material from the CPS if it's shown in court, and also how to deal with the police press office at the end of the case.
We were really polite about that. I think that one of the things that we felt that the students had come back on about the health and wellbeing experts was that it was a little bit patronising. The advice was a bit, stroke your pet, get a hobby to deal with all this sort of traumatic, you know. Yeah, exactly. Whereas what Polly and I tried to teach them was actually talking through the story was a form of therapy and catharsis in itself, and very much having the notebook in your hand acts as that barrier. So having that journalism sort of focused discussion, we felt gave them more relevant coping strategies than sort of general have a bath and watch Netflix.
Yeah, I mean, I should add, in the first year, they didn't take notes. They just came in, sat down, observed, and we wanted them to kind of soak up the atmosphere. I think this year we said to them, if you want to, you can take notes. So some of them did, some of them didn't. We didn't ask them to write a story. In the first year, we asked them to write a reflection so that we could sort of gather their thoughts about whether they thought it was a good idea. We asked them at the end, after they'd been to court, you know, was it useful? Did you feel prepared? Was it realistic? Those kind of questions. So we got some feedback. Obviously, I've only put the good comments on. I actually don't think there were any bad ones.
Apart from the wigs.
Yeah. I think it was important to have done a case like that, because the way the victim was being questioned and stuff, I don't think anything could have prepared me for that. I didn't expect it to be quite as much detail, but I'm really glad it was. Definitely prepared me to listen to those sort of details again. And then it was kind of uncomfortable to listen to, but it kind of needed to be.
I think that one of the big things that Polly and I had talked about when we tried to pitch for the budget for this as well is that we could have done this with tutors playing those roles, but it wouldn't have been at all realistic. It would have just been cringy. The students wouldn't have taken it seriously. And also you need really good actors. And apart from my turn as the fairy in the amateur dramatics that Kate Watkins is now in as well in our village, we don't really have that kind of acting chops in order to provide that kind of raw emotional experience, which is what we were really looking for. We were trying to show the student how difficult it can be to watch someone break down in tears in front of you, and without having professionals do that, it wouldn't have worked.
So we're hoping we'll be able to run it again next year. We've had conversations already about what we're going to do differently. I did tweet about it, and the head of comms from South Yorkshire Police got in touch, and she said, is this something we could get involved in? Our officers need media training. So I was like, brilliant. So the plan is, I don't know whether it will materialise, but the plan is to bring some officers in from South Yorkshire Police to hold some kind of press conference afterwards, and then for the students to be able to do like a one-to-one and get practice doing that and asking, you know, the SIO for quotes and that kind of thing. And the police get some media training. So that's the plan for next year.
I think we're at time, are we? Yep. Wait, we'll disappear. Thank you.
Thank you, ladies. Some shocking figures there at the start, but some brilliant answers to that as well. We will save questions to the end if that's okay. I'm sure there will be plenty. I'm going to hand next to Mike Greenwell, supported by Mandy, who's out there somewhere, hiding at the back. So I will, I'll get out of the way. That's going to change.
There we go. Okay, everyone. I'm Mike Greenwell. So I'm a BA Journalism course leader at Nottingham-Trent University, and I lead our Year 1 and Year 2 modules there. Amanda Ball is with me, Principal Lecturer at Nottingham-Trent University in the Centre for Broadcasting and Journalism, and also NCTJ Principal Examiner. So the title of the presentation, Courtroom Dramas, because this year and last and the year before we did experience so many dramas on our court visits with the students, but also in the context of trying to make the module more active in terms of students learning. There's a lot of academic theory around that. I'm not going to bore you that today though. But also against this idea of an inactive system. So I don't know if anyone's been to Nottingham. I know some of you are very much connected in the past, but Nottingham's a very unique place in relation to crime. Lots of organised crime, lots of gang crime, lots of violent crime. And so going to Nottingham Crown Court is quite an intimidating experience. So we chaperone our students before they then go on to visit independently. Now, the inactive system part is, at the moment, there has been so many different delays, post-COVID delays, closures to the court, leaking roofs, fire alarm issues, systems being inactive, that when you turn up there on any given day, you're faced with numerous challenges in terms of the list, in terms of things that we've talked about already or have been alluded to today, you know, big backlogs, big delays. There was a very interesting backlash from the actual judges down at the Crown Court, trying to get some investment in the court system from the judiciary, trying to improve these things. So that would be a challenge for most professional journalists, but imagine being a student and being faced with that, and you've never been in a courtroom before. So the things I want to actually just talk about a little bit more in terms of positionality of this presentation. Thank you to Lisa and Polly for providing such valuable context to the challenges we as educators face in relation to students, the level of need, the various anxiety issues that students have. So just put yourself in their shoes, you know, very different, as has been alluded to, their experiences and their perceptions. But think about ways and those experiences that they have. So when I take students to visit Crown Court, there's roughly about 70 or 80 students. We'll try plan that across 6 or 7 weeks, 12 students in each group. But week 1, week 2, you find yourself with a handful of students because not everyone's got the email or not everyone's quite ready to attend court at that point. Which then means you have 20, 25 students turning up in weeks 4, 5, 6, 7. So logistically, it's a big challenge to try and get students around various courts. There's 2 big courts at Nottingham. Most of this year, they've been occupied by gang trials and organised crime trials, where there's lots of mobile phone evidence, weeks and weeks of documents, weeks and weeks of files and folders. It's of no interest or any use as a learning experience. So that means you've got courts 3 through to about 12, very, very small packed courtrooms, very, very intimidating atmosphere, and the skills that we've been talking about communicating with court staff, they're the ones that we're trying to develop, those softer skills, in order to give them that experience that may inspire them to become the court reporters of the future. So lots of different challenges that we have encountered. We've talked about the added issues of some of the court management, some of the problems that they've faced. Peter Joyce compares the Nottingham Crown Court system to some kind of communist prison in the East Midlands news bulletin that we probably don't have time to watch, but maybe these slides will be shared. He's quite an entertaining KC. Okay, so we're reflecting on how we prepare our students for court. We, through active learning, provide them with activities to think about sexual offence restrictions, to think about absolute privilege, explaining to them, much like the first presentation explained, you know, there's things to prepare them in relation to resilience and some of the experiences. We do a mock kind of courtroom activity, nowhere near as well resourced as the one we've heard about. We do have a mock courtroom downstairs at Nottingham Trent, but getting in there is quite difficult. We provide them with story construction guidance. Afterwards, we talk about the various rights of journalists to make notes, to get names of various people. On reflection, maybe we'll do that before they go on their visit. But some of our students are quite confrontational due to some of their communication style, shall we say. And so empowering, you know what I mean, Lisa? So in terms of empowering them with those rights to challenge judges, the right to challenge court staff might not be the best way of working those relationships between myself, our students, and the court staff when we've got 70 odd of them to bring to court and hopefully get them feeling more confident and attending. They might not be allowed in, for example, if they confront an usher who doesn't want to give them a name. Or we're going to go through some headlines now of some of the experiences I've had while taking students to court. This was a huge case in Nottingham. It occurred during the first weeks of our court visit programme. And our students were shown the murder on screen of these four attacking Ricardo Cottrell, stabbing him 14 times and killing him. Now, there's all sorts of trigger warnings you can provide to students about what they're likely to see at court. But when they actually see it, you know, I was very, very worried. It, in fact, really inspired and motivated the students in attendance, thankfully. They were so interested, they were absolutely gripped by this case, and it was something that was very, very unique for them to experience. But that was pure luck, really. You risk assess these trips, you do as much preparation as you can in order to know what you're coming to see. But again, the system might be able to provide a little bit more information to assist both journalists and educators. So this was another case which was very, very captivating for our students. Where do you think the student was from? Which university in Nottingham do you think? Yeah, it happened to be an ex-NTU student. But again, there was lots and lots of aspects to this case that were quite confusing for the students. So a graduating student went out on graduation day, ended up going out at a local nightclub. They were about to be ejected, their party, and so the boyfriend of the defendant was escorted out, and so the student in this headline decided to jump on his back and bite him. Okay? Nice. So what was confusing for our students, though, was that the bouncer was giving evidence behind a screen. Now, we teach about witnesses being in genuine fear and distress and why they might be anonymised a bit later on in the module, but they just weren't sure as to what was going on. This was quite a sensitive case. Thankfully, nothing goes out to publication. These are year one students who go on this court visit first of all. They produce a court portfolio with an independent court visit, so they will go after we've chaperoned them. They'll produce a magistrate's court story from supplied court notes, and they'll do 2 legal analyses. So that's just a little bit of information about the assessment. Okay, so that was a good day when our student entered. An usher tried to show them to a seat, and they had a panic attack in the middle of a trial. Okay, again, nothing can quite prepare you for that. Few more experiences we've had. This was extremely interesting for the students. So the Cottrell trial had to actually be reopened because alleged gang members, they were gang members, were coming in and spotting jurors who they potentially recognised, and there was one in particular that they did, and then they continued to come back and forth. So eyeball this juror until the jury had to be discharged. And these people were sat just behind us. Students, again, thought it was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. So to brand them all as snowflakes, to brand them all as kind of, you know, lacking resilience is not always an appropriate characterisation. That was the moment that they found most interesting. Once you've got a hook for your students to come back to, it makes teaching these concepts a lot more straightforward. You've got a point of reference for them. This is the bit around active learning. It's the point of something that is experiential. It's something that's based on something real, something tangible, something that they've shared, something that they can talk about. And that's some of the things that really brings law teaching to life. So this was the same trial, okay? Thankfully, my students were in neighbouring courts during this, because I think I'd have been in a lot of trouble had any students been part of this fight. You know, again, we risk assess, but there's a grey area here. Okay, particularly when you're trying to get students into different courts, there's only a certain amount of capacity. So the day which you're bringing numerous students, more than the group number you've planned for, you are letting them wander off into different courts. So you don't quite have eyes on them all the time, okay? That was quite scary. Okay, this was another one. I believe the group is called Cannibal Corpse. Now, no matter how much etiquette you provide for students, no matter how much you talk about dress code, talk about professional skills, if they don't get the memo, and usually they go into court outside of the scheduled times because they're a bit late on their assessment. This was tweeted about by a local journalist. It was really, really shocking for some of the people at court. They were not happy at all. It was completely inappropriate, particularly in relation to the nature of the case. And this was also a really, really worrying day. It was of the court lists, but still within the precincts, and they were trying to get some last-minute advice on which case to go and see. So, what are the things I've learnt from this? Don't assume anything with students, okay? Handouts, everything belt and braces. So if you've given some kind of talk on etiquette and professional expectations, give them a handout also. Give them something online to engage with. Try cover all bases. Obviously, organising multiple groups of students is very, very demanding. But students are inspired by this experience. So don't shy away from it. People in the room who are part of the system, if you can try facilitate this as much as possible for educators, it's hugely beneficial if we want to create court reporters of the future. This, in my view, is an essential experience for them to go to court, and then they will also have the confidence to go independently. In terms of blended classroom learning, scale-up activities, it takes loads and loads of planning, and it's very much trial and error. But I think what I've found is it's got to be a mix, so still that traditional lecture seminar style, so you are sure that certain concepts have been particularly recorded when you're doing lectures, but you build on that varied approach. Courts want to help generally, but staff also get the wrong idea of what we're after as journalists and what our students will benefit from. So when students are sat in preliminary hearings or administrative hearings for the experience, that's no good for their assessment, and they can sometimes get a bit grouchy themselves, the students, as well as the court staff, because they feel like their time is being wasted. I've also been down to court, we've sat there for 2 hours, an interpreter's not been found, and we've come out with literally nothing, and there's nothing worse or demotivating for students than that sort of thing. All of this is compounded post-COVID. All of this is compounded because of various issues, particularly at Nottingham Crown Court. Okay, thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mike, for inadvertently giving us enough material for the next year of court reporting exams. I think they're what not to do, folks. So look out for that one coming soon. Thank you very much. We are next coming to Helen Johnston. How are we doing for time? Just about okay?
Yeah, just move it. Yeah, we're okay.
who is going to speak to us about getting student access to the public gallery. So I'll hand over to Helen Johnson from the University of Salford.
Hi, thanks very much. So I teach on Level 4 Law and Ethics module. And as part of our BJTC accreditation, we have to have every student go on a court visit. It's not just for the court reporting modules, it's every student. They have to have visited a court but also had the opportunity to make notes and also write a story, or at the very least write down what they've observed, because sometimes if there isn't a story that they can write from what they've seen, they still write down whatever they have experienced. So it is viewed as an essential experience, and I think somebody's already mentioned, I think Mike might have just mentioned about experiential learning. It does have more value. Kolb, this 4-stage experiential cycle, learning through experience provides deeper understanding and better retention of knowledge. So it's definitely worthwhile to give students real life experiences so they can go and experience the job of a court reporter, reflect on it, analyse, draw some conclusions, something like I need to learn shorthand, and then try a new strategy next time. And our programmes generally, journalism programmes generally do involve experiential learning, because we're often trying to simulate the real world of journalism. However, from my personal experience and from anecdotal evidence, it appears that getting students into court and getting them being able to take notes is sometimes not very easy. So I undertook a small survey just to try and get a snapshot of how big a problem it is around the country, really, and how widespread it is. So the survey was 11 questions, mixed of closed and open. I sent it to 14 journalism educators in UK universities who I identified as teaching court reporting and/or media law, and I got 10 responses. I used mixed methods to analyse the data, which was anonymised, and then identified themes from the free text answers. So the results then, 8 out of 10 do take students on court visits. Half have had issues getting access for students. Everybody was aware of the Courts and Tribunals guidance on access and note-taking. A small number have challenged court staff on this, sometimes with the CTS guidance, but one person said with the Ewing case, Ewing versus Cardiff Crown Court from 2016, which was specifically about the public's right to take notes. Number restrictions ranged from 5 to 24, so number of students being allowed to take into court. So behind those numbers then, the 2 that don't do court visits anymore, one was from a setting where media law is taught across a cohort that includes sport and football journalism, and they decided that they needed to cover more relevant content for those groups. And another setting has stopped because they're not offering court reporting as an optional module anymore. Difficulties with access then. The worst culprits seem to be Crown Court across the range of courts. Magistrates and coroners were generally considered to be more amenable. Some of the answers, it's a constant issue at Crown Court in particular, sometimes due to structural issues and a backlog of cases, mainly Crown. Coroners' courts, generally, they were deemed to be more helpful. Some positives, though. Some people were saying we've got good relationships with our courts. Staff even at Crown Court, somebody said, yeah, that we find them helpful. Very few issues at MAGs. There were some responses where staff were letting the courts know that they were going, and that's something that I do here because the courts have asked us to do that so that they can prepare. And so, other people are doing that as well. And in one setting, they changed their day because another group was going. Somebody else, they planned to go on the same day as a group of police cadets, so they swapped their day so that they weren't, creating a problem with too many people going. Student awareness of note-taking guidelines then. Most people were saying that they do teach that to their students to make sure that they are aware that they are allowed to take notes. But some were saying that they asked them to ask the staff if it's okay, just as a courtesy, even though they don't actually have to. You know, students can take notes like any member of the public's entitled to, but we make a point of advising them just to let the ushers know. Somebody else, I remind students of the rights of the press and use the Ewing case that hopefully the students will remember and be able to challenge if needed. And a broad discussion about access to courts and how important it is to be able to take notes as a matter of public record, and as well as serving the public interest. Court staff awareness, a bit mixed. Some people were saying, yeah. Well, one person said, in my experience, that most of them aren't aware of it. And I have had that experience as well. 3 participants said that they or their students had to refer court staff to that guidance or the Ewing case because they'd been told that they couldn't take notes. Somebody else said court staff are mostly helpful. However, a lot of key information isn't read out in court anymore. So such as, you know, the defendant's name, address, all of that basic information to be able to write a court story isn't read out. So then the students are either having to go to the clerk on the day and, you know, and that's sometimes a bit daunting for students to do, or email afterwards and then try and pick up that information. So that's become more of an issue. Yeah, court staff awareness then, again, Crown Court that seem to be the worst offender. Students frequently told by ushers they can't take written notes without the permission of the judge. Somebody else saying that they've had students being told they can't take notes or they need to make sure they ask for permission. Had written to the court about this because students had been stopped from doing it and had also kicked up a fuss on X. So I don't know whether that produced good results, but it might have done. Number restrictions then, we're not even allowed to do this. We have a set number of students and we can't even divide them between the courts, but somebody else does that. Sometimes students have had to leave the public gallery to allow families in to sit in hearings, you know, which I suppose is fair enough really. And some magistrates' courts in particular have very few seats. Some participants were pointing out that it's not just students who experience problems. There was one, somebody pointed out a recent example from last year, quite a high-profile case, where professional journalists and students waited almost 2 hours outside a courtroom, only to be told the case had been heard in camera and sent to London. Somebody also shared with me that a professional journalist had things were so bad at this particular Crown Court that they'd written an opinion piece about the state of these dilapidated court facilities, which included a leaking roof and all sorts of other horrors. So those numbers then, you know, like I said, between 5 and 24, some people taking 12, 8, 5 at Coroner's Court. That was justified because other students, paramedics and medical students, needed to be in there as well. One lucky person managed to take 24 in one. The final comment I thought was quite interesting, that somebody was told there was a restriction by the usher, but just waited until that usher had gone and then took the high number in anyway. Maybe it was the grumpy usher that they'd come across, who knows, but yeah, sometimes we have to be a bit sneaky. So when has all these access problems started? COVID obviously took a toll. So some people were saying started around 2020, 2021. Somebody else said last year the incorrect note-taking guidance they noticed started last year. One person said that it's been going on for 20 years, ever since they started teaching court reporting in 2005. Somebody else said it's never been an issue. But I just thought maybe that those two outliers, maybe the difference was the length of time teaching. Obviously, the longer you teach, the more problems you might encounter. The main difficulties then, the main one was around taking notes, being told that they weren't allowed, or that there were certain details that they couldn't include, such as addresses. I had a court official saying that they weren't allowed to take names down, which you know, this person ignored it, and I ignored it as well. and explain to the students that of course you have to have the name and those other addresses. It's ridiculous. So sometimes students who are going unaccompanied have been told that they can't take notes. One person said that some unaccompanied students were told to stop writing notes until they'd taken advice from the court clerk had taken advice from the judge, which meant they couldn't write down the defence. So they actually didn't have their fair, accurate story to be able to go back with. Sometimes being denied entry for spurious reasons, a basic lack of information, so a courtroom in one Crown Court, a press room in one Crown Court has been locked for years. Some students not being provided with information and being told it's against data protection. Lots of, spurious reasons. It kind of really sums it up. One person did say that they were restricted to taking 6 at a time, which has meant they can't take all their students, so they have to do it on a first-come, first-served basis because they don't have the staff hours to be able to go and do that. On the other hand, there were some positives. Some people saying some court staff were really helpful. Ushers were helpful to the students. Some engagement from judges, barristers, and again, coroners being particularly helpful and accommodating. So because of all these problems, people have been looking at alternatives to visits. 6 of the 10 participants were lucky enough to have a moot or mock courtroom in their university to be able to use for simulated proceedings. Other people were using videos of sentencing, other online material, scripted court proceedings with staff or students playing roles, guest talks by magistrates and judges, and various other innovative ways of trying to get around it. However, the feeling was that nothing really compares to actually going out and going to a real court, having a real court visit. Simulated proceedings are far from ideal, but they complement the real thing. No substitute to attending a court in person, and somebody else not a fan of alternative court visit experiences. So to conclude then, court visits are just about alive and well. Despite all of these challenges, restrictions on numbers, problems with taking notes, crumbling buildings, unhelpful staff, all of those. Difficulties vary by location and by the type of court. Still some positive experience though with court staff and some engagement from magistrates and judges, and resourceful lecturers using alternatives, but largely to complement court visits rather than to replace them. Thank you.
Right, great stuff. Thanks, everyone. So for this next session, we're joined by another great panel of guests, as you see, and so I'm just going to hand over to take us through it to, from City St George's, Richard Danbury. Richard.
Thank you all for staying to almost the bitter end. I'm looking around the room and it's a little emptier than it was in the beginning, which of course is completely understandable because it's a lovely day. Our session is on what works and what doesn't work, and it's drawn from our teaching at City St George's. And as well as two of the primary teachers at City St George's, we've also got, in true Blue Peter fashion, we've got one we prepared earlier. This is Sian on my right-hand side. Sian's a former student of mine, but also I've actually discovered is a former student of Lisa's at Sheffield as well. And she is a graduate of City's MA programme, and she wrote a very impressive article after some investigation at the beginning of this year for the Times about inside the family court. We had the family courts mentioned slightly earlier on, and Sian's going to talk about that. We also have at the far end of the table, we have Jill, who is a co-author of McNay, and also for many years was head of editorial legal at The Guardian. And we have Tom. Thomas is finishing his PhD at Edinburgh University and is a graduate of this institution as well. He was at Salford. Who are me? So I'm going to start with me. My name's Richard Danbury. I was, a long time ago, this is my guilty secret, a barrister. And so all of those people who've been nasty about lawyers earlier on, I was taking notes. And I spent lots of time knocking around magistrates' courts and a little bit of time knocking around Crown courts. And interestingly enough, despite all the narratives about declining journalistic attendance in courts, I only ever once saw a journalist in any of the court I attended as a lawyer. And that was when I was defending someone who was alleged to have doped some greyhounds, and that was someone from the Racing Post. It was absolutely true. And he got information out of me which he shouldn't have got out of me. But nothing happened, thank goodness. That drives my, and before after that I was 10 years at the BBC, and I did largely investigations and interviews, and I started, after I went off and started doing academic stuff, I started teaching at the BBC Law, and I'm still teaching at the BBC Law now, so after this tomorrow I'm teaching over the road media law. So we're going to talk in a little bit about how we deliver the media law, and particularly court reporting tuition at City, but I just wanted to start by taking a slightly different spin on everything we've heard so far. A large amount of what we've been hearing so far is completely appropriate about court reporting what goes on in court. The stuff which I did was getting information out of the courts for investigations and so on. So I spent, when I was on Panorama, I spent about 6 months sitting at the back of court in the Old Bailey with the guy from Channel 4 News, Jeremy Britton. I don't know if anyone's come across him. Jeremy Britton is the BBC's court reporter. He basically lives in a cupboard underneath the Old Bailey. The BBC has a specific office in the Old Bailey. It's the only place where you can take photographs in the Old Bailey as a matter of kind of weird precedent, and it's in the basement, and Jeremy lives there. And we sat through 6 months of Crevice, Operation Crevice, which is a terrorism trial. And Jeremy's doing the daily court reporting stuff, but the man from Channel 4 News and I were trying to get information out of the courts and out of the lawyers and out of the solicitors and trying to find various documents. In the end, we came out with two quite good stories. One was the extent of MI5's prior knowledge of the 7/7 bombing, which came out of the Operation Crevice. And second was MI5's complicity in torture, allegations of torture in relation to some of the defendants and witnesses in that trial. Both of those weren't pieces of information which came out from day-to-day court reporting. They were from sitting around in the court, making friends with people and finding things out. So that's a slightly different slant we're going on to, and we'll get back to that with Sian at the end of it. Before I hand over to Thomas, a couple of things first. One is what works. We've had quite a few comments about teaching court reporting as an activity, and I just wanted to point you towards something we did, which you may or may not find useful, during the dark days of COVID. And that's pointing you towards a BBC, it's very old now, but it's still quite useful, a BBC dramatic reconstruction of a fictional court case with real lawyers. And it's accurate, or at least it was accurate when it came out in terms of procedure, and it's accurate in terms of the real barristers and real judge, the the defendant are all actors, but the members of the public are all real members of the public. It's a program called Trial by Jury, and it's available on Box of Broadcast. The reason I'm plugging it is because I was the legal advisor on it, and it was my first ever journalistic activity. But the reason for mentioning it is it's quite a good activity to show your students who don't want to go into court for the first time, to show it as a dry run about what court reporting does. Slightly inaccurate because you have a nice little voiceover summonsing some of the details, and you have people's names appearing on screen, so which means you don't actually have to write them down, but that could be quite useful for students who've never been to court to start with as a kind of soft entry. Okay, a little bit about City. City, as you know, is quite big. We are all teaching on the postgraduate course, although Thomas also teaches law on the undergraduate course. It's around about 210 students. They have about 7 or 8 different sub-degrees. The tuition about media law is for all of those students, and then there's sub-degrees, including investigative, which is where Sian was. They're where the actual court reporting activities happening and the assessment towards court reporting. So the information is disseminated in one chunk, and then other activities are going out and doing the reporting stuff. The students are mainly UK, but there are a considerable amount of international students, which poses a problem. The standard of knowledge at the beginning is nothing. They know nothing about law at all. They know nothing about media law. I once made the mistake in one of my classes of looking around and saying, does anyone know anything about the courts who has been in the court before? You can guess what happens. One of my students sticks up their hand. He'd been a defendant in the court before. That was a question I'm never going to ask again. Okay, so the lectures are two-handers. We've got Tom, who's an academic, and we've got Jill, who's a practitioner. And there are assessments, which we'll probably talk about later, which are based on the scenario exams. And perhaps Thomas can talk about our wrangling with AI, which, as we all know, AI can pass law exams. So, Thomas, I will pass over to you.
To Jill.
Oh, sorry, I've Thomas over to Jill. That's right.
It's all right. I can be nimble. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And yes, as I said, I was an in-house lawyer at The Guardian, and I've also done a bit at the Beeb and Times and Sunday Times over the years. Retired about 18 months ago. And I've been teaching on the journalism MA for 2 years, and I also co-write the McNays, although Sian does all the court reporting stuff, I'm pleased to say, because that's the difficult bit. So I've just got a few sort of perspectives really from that standpoint, in terms of both being in-house and seeing what the journalists don't get, as well as what the students don't get, and where difficulties arise. So the first thing I wanted to say was, and it's sort of come up a couple of times in what people have said, Sian mentioned the Suzanne Holdsworth case this morning, and the first session also looked at the impact on child defendants. I think one of the issues with what is around what to report, and I think that there is a tendency for journalists to think they can publish everything if it's a fair, accurate, contemporaneous report, and not to think, but do I have to publish everything? And the privacy implications and the data implications these days, even if you're publishing open court, straightforward court reporting, these days there are lots and lots of people writing in saying, take my name out, I object to this, it's been 6 months, there was an appeal, I've been acquitted, blah, 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 blah. And I think sometimes journalists can be a bit more savvy about that when they write about these things, thinking ahead. I mean, if you're writing about a particularly gruesome case, and there's lots of details about the victim, and you've got the victim's name all over there, then that's all going to be Googleable and searchable. And do you really need to put their name in, or the whole of their name? Sometimes people have really distinctive names, and it hangs over them for a long time. And I just think that from an ethical perspective, not a legal perspective at all, thinking about that a little more, thinking ahead about it and how it might impact is something that just doesn't generally tend to happen. And sometimes, certainly at The Guardian, it would be left to the lawyer going, you sure about that? Do you need, editorially, it's your choice what you put in the piece. But, so I sort of just wanted to say that, and sometimes there's a tendency to think, well, the court can manage these things. The court manages the privacy rights of the parties. But journalists can also absolutely have a choice over what they do and don't say in that sort of scenario. Second thing I wanted to say was, because generally court reporting and contempt is taught as a standalone topic, it really means a lot of it is focused on what you can't say. You can't do this and you can't do that, and there's a whole load of restrictions over here that you must not ever go into. And I think sometimes students don't fully appreciate what they can report. You know, that again, whether you're looking at a preliminary hearing or you're looking at the full trial, in defamation terms, you've got absolute protection for fair, accurate and contemporaneous reports. You've still got qualified protection, even if it's not contemporaneous. And you've got the contempt protection in section 4. And I think sometimes they just don't put those bits together in terms of the defamation risk or the privacy risk, in terms of the court reporting aspects of it. And I think it's very hard to teach that, because it doesn't quite fit in. You can't really talk about that when you're doing defamation, because they haven't done court reporting, so they're just completely blank. And by the time you get to court reporting, they're sort of rather overwhelmed with the volume, so they don't get that particularly sort of important thing. And on that same theme, I think another thing increasingly, and again it's been touched on today, is how well equipped they are with regard to knowing what documents they can ask a court for. Particularly this comes out, I mean, in the criminal courts it's not so difficult because there's the media guidance and the protocol. In the civil courts, where you can these days get skeletons, witness statements and court documents, but if people are being difficult about it, you might have to write to the judge, to the parties, to whoever. And again, it's something that we don't really, certainly we don't teach that practical side, but in terms of what Richard's probably going to talk about, which is getting access to information. There's enormous amounts of information in court cases. They're not always so well equipped with regard to that practical thing, and they're well equipped by McNays to stand up and object to reporting restrictions. But in terms of saying, I'd like this document, please, now, because I need to have that in order to explain what's going on in this court case today when I write it. You don't want to wait 3 weeks while someone pontificates about it, or the judge says, I'll deal with that afterwards. So I think sort of that's something that I'm conscious that maybe we don't do enough of. I think that another problem, sorry, I'm just going to be negative. Another problem, typical lawyer, don't ask them back. Despite however much effort you try, journalists don't understand the difference between arrest and charge. And for contempt of court purposes, of course, arrest is key. It comes quite early. I think that feeds back into some of the discussion that there's been about not understanding the system. They don't understand that arrest is a police thing. Charging is when the state really gets involved and the CPS get involved, and then there's going to be a trial. So, and I mean, this is, very experienced journalists at The Guardian come in and they say, oh, I thought I'd come and ask you about this piece because I see they've been charged. And you go, too bloody late. It should have been asking us about it weeks ago. So I don't know how you again, feed that into the practicalities of the court visit and appreciating the court system. I think Thomas will say a bit more about what they know. I think there's also a sort of slight tendency for some journalists, particularly the sport, travel, fashion, who go, I don't need to know anything about court reporting. And as you will all know, that is very far from the truth, that all of those areas end up in court at various times. And so there are some people who sort of go, yeah, well, it's nothing to do with me. The other thing that I think came out particularly marking the exam this year was that we gave them a sort of bit of court reporting, two scenarios, and they had to rewrite it so that it was conformed with the law. It wasn't an open court trial. It was first hearing before the magistrates, where loads and loads of stuff gets said, most of which can't be reported, and they're very, very confused about that and about what might be prejudicial. I mean, some of the things that, this might be a reflection on our teaching, of course, and that's for another day, Richard. I just thought it was really interesting how they, you sort of talk about things being prejudicial, without possibly going into sort of quite enough explanation of what you really mean by prejudicial. But the first hearing, where all this stuff in open court is said, it's still barred, and they were very confused about pre-trial, preparatory trial, as are we sometimes. I think that's probably where I'll leave it. Just some sort of thoughts about little nuancy bits that are difficult, I think, to fit in with just the standard way in which, the linear way in which these things are taught.
Just to interject, one of the ways that the two of you teach together is that Thomas explains what the law is on the books and Jill explains what the law is in practice. And just kind of, how does that work for you? Is that successful, or do you kind of think, my God, this is not working?
No, I mean, I think that the large group, I mean, we did two things from the first year I did this to the second year I did it. The first year we had just two large lectures and then a lot of small groups. And the second year it was just all large groups. And I think that all large groups work pretty well. It was much easier to manage. There was a consistency of the teaching and what they could all, they could all hear each other asking the questions. That otherwise some groups are much more interactive. But I also think, I mean, I think they really enjoyed having two voices, so not that Tom drones at all, and he's very entertaining, very entertaining in his lectures. But I mean, I would just stand up and say, here's an example of this is what happened, and I think that worked pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, my main piece of advice would be get yourself a Jill. My anecdotes are brief. Jill's anecdotes are world-changing in some aspects. So it's. Do you have more to say? Otherwise, I'll start rambling on.
We can segue. It's a nice segue.
Lovely. So yeah, I mean, so I'm an academic lawyer. My research is looking at the way AI is implemented in newsrooms and where we look at legal duties and regulatory duties. And so I'm not a journalist, and that's one of the things that controversially I think works and everyone else thinks doesn't. Lots of people that I've spoke to at other institutions are like, well, we don't want a lawyer to teach our media law because they won't get it. But we seem to think it works. Maybe a little bit biased, but the students seem to think it works. But the initial challenge that I always think is that on day one, no one signing up for a degree in journalism is doing it because they're really excited for the media law component. That's the bit they're dreading. Then they get the reading list, and it's quite a bulky book.
It's a lovely book.
It's a really wonderful book, and it's a reason that we all probably have a very dogged copy of it. But it's a large book, and they're not used to it for a lot of different reasons. So trying to get them on side is probably the first few hours, and we only give them 2 hours a week. So it's a lot of time trying to get them on side. I think we do that fairly successfully. But some of the other things that we have as a challenge are, where do we situate teaching students about law for them to become journalists? Like, are we giving them a primer? Are we giving them the basics to be able to say, right, okay, that's enough for you to go and probably not get the university in trouble? Or are we giving them a comprehensive course that prepares them for employment and prepares them for an industry that requires them really to have the knowledge from day one? There is no real industry standard on where a journalist should start and what media law they should have from day one, because lots of them will have in-house training, and lots of them will say, well, you didn't have a journalism degree, you do have a journalism degree, you've had some training, you haven't. I'm sure that other people will agree, but it sits in a sort of weird middle ground of, we want you to be aware enough because we have a duty to make sure that if you're going out and reporting on behalf of the university, it doesn't come back to bite us in the arse. But we also want you to be fully and comprehensively prepared to go into an industry. So I think that what we have found work is that basing it in very solid legal grounding has always worked for us. As Jill said, we previously had an approach of having lots of small groups. We tried to split them up, so 200 odd students in sort of 8 to 10 groups. I think it was about 8 to 10. The issue then is the one that we've all banged on about today, which is we all want consistency in everything that we do, and it's very difficult to have 8 to 10 groups and still be consistent. So we switched, and we have one very large group that has a lot of consistency, because it's the two of us and occasionally Richard telling us that we're wrong, quite successfully. And that has worked for us, and we think a consistent approach of delivery has worked. Small groups, it always seems good on paper to be able to stimulate discussion, have all these excellent things, but for us, it lacked the consistency because we had so many different tutors teaching, and everyone had slightly different approaches and slightly different opinions on things that aren't necessarily settled. So that consistency is something that worked for us. Another difficulty that sort of seems obvious, but it's really tough to navigate, is that when they come in with no knowledge, one of the first things you need to do is teach them the structure of the courts. And for many of them, it's a literal foreign concept. They've come over to the UK, they're international students, and not only are they now having to learn a new system of law, but based in a system of courts that they've never even heard of before. And we tell them that there is a civil court system and a criminal court system. And then, and I don't know about the rest of you, but for a large portion of it, we completely forget the civil court system exists. And we go straight into court reporting and criminal courts, and yes, there is a lot more risk arguably involved in it. But we want to see journalists going into all of these court systems. But we shy away from talking about the civil court system because A, it's not as juicy, it's not as exciting, but B, it's not as risky. So we spend a lot more time talking on criminal reporting. So we break it down. We have a week on contempt of court. We have a week on reporting restrictions. Another issue that we encounter is that on a week on reporting restrictions, we're asking them to read the relevant chapters in McNay's, and their reading has gone from 2 chapters to about 11. And funnily enough, we get a few complaints about that. That suddenly in a week, when they've got all of these other modules that they're doing, they now have to read 11 chapters. I tell them to skim it and come back to it when they have time, but they're master's students, they never have time. So, again, we come back to that issue of, are we trying to prime them, or are we trying to comprehensively give them a solid grounding? And it really is a difficult one to manage. I thought I would take the initiative and ask the students for feedback, particularly on the court reporting, the reporting restrictions, contempt of court lectures, to ask, do you have any feedback on what works or what didn't? Because I'm going to go and talk about it, so that'd be lovely. And I got some very nice feedback from the 2 out of 200 that replied. But one of them said it would have been wonderful if they had some practical advice on what they're allowed to bring or not allowed to bring into each court. Can they take a phone in? Can they take a laptop in? Are they allowed to make notes? And I was like, yes, that would be wonderful. When we know, we'll let you know. And this was something that they're like, but surely there's consistent guidance on this. So surely there would be. And it's really difficult because, we're teaching in London. We have London universities. It's been really wonderful hearing how you all have these great relationships with court clerks and judges and people coming in. If anything represents the north-south divide more than that, it's that we do not have that. We go into courts and they're like, oh. Admittedly, sometimes we're taking 30 students in, but we're also taking them to much bigger courts in some instances. But it's very tough for us, and maybe that's me taking a London-centric view, but it's very difficult for us to get any sort of engagement from the courts. So it's a struggle to be able to give them practical advice beforehand from people who are working in the courts, because they don't really have the time of day for us in a lot of instances. My one recommendation has always been, because it caught me out when I did a mini pupillage years ago, was like, don't take a fork in with you to eat your lunch, because you'll embarrassingly have it taken off you. But just to highlight the point that, the things you think are fine are not necessarily going to be fine. You pack your bag for the day, you go to court, and suddenly you're like, oh, I'm not getting all of these things through. I thought I could take a phone and I can't, and I thought I could use my laptop to take notes, but I can't. And to be able to sort of tell them, well, actually, we don't always know either, because sometimes judges will have a very different opinion depending on what side of the bed they woke up on, is not great from a lecturing perspective to be able to say, well, this is the state of play as it is. And sometimes it'll alienate them. We've heard quite a lot today about how difficult some students find it to go into court anyway, but to say that we can't necessarily even give them structured practical advice on walking through the door and what's going to happen reliably is quite difficult. And I realise that both Jill and I have taken a rather large doom and gloom approach to this, But what we have found work is that, as we said, this practical sort of tag team approach that we have, you know, I find some topics very easy to talk about, and this is one of the things with court reporting particularly, is that it doesn't just, it's a bit of a misnomer to say it's just court reporting. It's not just about going into courts and reporting, because suddenly you have to take into account, okay, well, what about the privacy of the people I'm reporting on? What about the privacy of their families? What about my defamation risks? And to say that, you know, students suddenly are like, but I thought court reporting was just about going into court and reporting and coming out again. And partly yes, but also there is this wide area of things. Like I was thinking, right, okay, today we're all talking about court reporting. How many areas of law come up throughout the day? And with, I think, the first session, we had defamation coming up. Someone had briefly mentioned things that fall under data protection and privacy and all of these areas. And it's, you know, we're trying to sort of say, yes, we have 2 weeks where we'll talk to you largely about things that happen in relation to trials, court cases. But it matters from day one. It matters from when you're learning about the court structure, so you know where you have standing to go and sit in a court and which courts are closed. It matters when you're thinking about defamation. This is why we publish addresses, which students sometimes seem completely abhorred by the idea that we're publishing people's addresses. And that leads me on to another point, and then I'll finish, which is one of the biggest issues I found is, and this is maybe more with the undergraduates, is that they find it very difficult to leave their moral objections at the door. When we tried to talk about the fact that you can't necessarily report a previous conviction because it's going to be a contempt of court, and I give the example of David Carrick, the ex-Met police officer, and the rather large list of convictions that he had. I had students that were ready to tear me to pieces for telling them that they couldn't report that, even though but he's very clearly guilty. And I was like, do you not see the problem with what you're saying right now? Like, yes, he may well be, but there also could have been someone else that did it the 21st time and not the other 20. And they were really sort of struggling to get their heads around that. And again, I think it's a difference that I see between undergraduate and postgraduate. But again, I'm a lawyer, so take everything I say with several pinches of salt. But overall, I think that the combination of solid legal grounding from a legal professional mixed in with a practitioner who is able to say, well, you know, this actually happened to me and this is what it looked like, has worked incredibly well for us. It's allowed us to be consistent. It does mean that the one thing I'm saying that works is us, and I realise that that's not something that people can really take out from this. But I'm sure Rich and Sean are going to show much more examples of how it has worked overall.
I mean, I think just one other thing I'd say on the teaching side. Well, the first time I taught it, we did the court reporting and contempt first, and that was a very bad idea, really. It was just too much, too soon, too much detail. So this last session we did a bit on the English legal system, then we did defamation, and then we did the court reporting. And it was definitely better received than doing all that. It was just far too much too quickly, certainly in the way that it just all came down the line for them. And I do think that we got much more engagement, I think, doing it slightly later in the whole legal module, as it were.
Yeah, I think giving them defamation first was great because it was, in their eyes, much juicier than being told what restrictions apply to pre-trial hearings at a magistrate's court, which isn't exactly the most exciting piece of information. I think maybe we'd look at it again next year and wonder if maybe even privacy is something that we could slot in beforehand because it's so relevant. And I get to talk about Max Mosley, and that suddenly livens the room up every single time. But yeah, I definitely think that positioning in it, where you put it in the course, like how much of a background do you need, is something that we have to actively think about every time.
Okay, thank you very much, Tom and Jill. So I'm going to read the headline. Inside the UK's family courts, frustration, tears and long delays. The Stand first. A glimpse into the previously hidden world of deeply emotional battles and desperate fights for contact with children now that journalists can apply to watch proceedings. The parents had, I'm going to stop now. The parents had attended a dozen hearings to determine custody arrangements by the time I joined them at West London's Family Court on a gloomy day in November for the father to appeal a court order. He was sent on a caring dad parenting course to understand the continued abuse his ex-partner, including swearing at her in front of their crying daughter, had affected their child. So we've been talking about court reporting as students,
Yes.
so you are an example of having done it. Tell us a little bit about how you got to it.
So I joined the Times as on the graduate trainee scheme with actually many years of experience as a journalist before then. And when I was doing my MA, I was really interested in family courts because I think it was just starting to become more of a thing. And then fast forward to seeing Louise Tickle tweet that she was trying to train some people to get them in for the Transparency Week, and I thought, amazing. So I got in touch, and I mean, the brilliant thing that I think you can't really teach in the classroom is, you know, I work for a place that has enough money to just have me go, and, you know, has enough reporters that someone that's just started their training, they don't need me for a week. So, you know, it's also just about the kind of chances that you can take when you are in these spaces. So I basically just pitched it to my editors, saying that it would be amazing for me to go, because, you know, not a lot of people, even no one at the Times really has like consistently been going, and they were like, sure, go. So I went for a whole week. Louise was amazing and linked me up with you know, some helpful judge and a barrister and things like that, and that was crucial because, as I think we've heard a lot today, like the inconsistency across the week was quite something. You know, so I spent the first few days in West London Court, and it was just such a different experience. I think something that I've really thought about today is there is such a difference between like learning about court reporting, even going into the court, versus doing it for yourself. Because when you're going into the court as a student, you're all in your little gaggle and you feel nervous, but you're with each other, and you can kind of, you know, be like, oh, did you miss that? I missed that name. Can you tell me what it is? And are we allowed to be? And oh, you go. You're more confident, you know. And I remember doing even that in my MA, kind of, you know, banding together, and then suddenly in the family court, it's just me in a space with people that hadn't actually really seen journalists before, didn't really want me there, families that were very unnerved by me being there, and nothing can really prepare you for that other than something that Louise just drilled in me, that I'll like always just hold with me now, is just knowing my legal right to be there, and just having that in my head, because it meant that whoever could challenge me, I didn't feel put on the spotlight or anything, because I just knew that I'd already told the court. I mean, it's a lot of emails and a lot of admin with family courts still, even in the Transparency Week. Even there was signs up at the court saying that this is a Transparency Week for reporters, and there was still ushers that had no idea what I was talking about, judges that had never heard of the Transparency Week, you know, ranging all the way to people that were like incredibly helpful. So I just had to really know why I was there, but that's again another practical difference, is kind of knowing why you deserve to be there, and then sitting in front, you know, sat next to a mom that is, you know, talking in the family and drug, you know, alcohol support court, which was really interesting, and I think needs more reporting on, because it's more of a, you know, therapeutic model. And the judge in that case was really, really great, but the mom just couldn't understand why a journalist would be there, and especially again in the magistrates, you were talking about, you know, wanting more journalists to report on everyday cases. The kind of the wall that journalists come up against is not just convincing your editor, you know, why people might read about somebody that we don't know, taking a complete gamble on whether it's going to be an interesting case. That's half of the battle, and then the other half of the battle is being able to be sensitive and kind of personable enough, but also legally prepped enough to explain to a family why their little mundane life you know, in their eyes, and the worst time of their life too, because this is about, you know, children and people's children being taken off them, and it's just why are you going to be here? Am I going to be splashed all over the front of the Times? You know, is my family going to be dragged through even more when I've just spent 2 years, you know, coming to court to try and gain access to my child again? So it really is about building trust, and I think you know, it's really important that that kind of media organisations keep allowing people like me to go and do this for themselves. Because there was also families that were really grateful that I was there, because they felt like my presence might, you know, make the proceedings fairer, or just felt like having that kind of outside, you know, third party made them feel like there was more transparency. I had an instance, and there is just so much to learn. I had an instance where outside of the court, because it is very different to criminal court, there was no other journalist there while I was there, because I was just covering like short cases, daily cases, so that I could try the most. And I did private law, public law, the drug and alcohol, I did an appeal, and this mother just started talking to me about her case just outside the courtroom, and talking about, you know, what had been kind of happening up to that point, and what her partner had been doing. And I had to stop her and say, I'm a journalist, by the way, and, you know, just be careful, kind of, to just make sure. I was like, you know, I'm not going to now just run away and report this, but just, a lot of these people would just not expect a journalist to be there at all. And I kind of forget what my point is, but it was again from just having judges that would argue my case as well, because I found that there was some barristers, who were really off put by me being there, and you know, were kind of outraged that they hadn't been warned, because, you know, I was telling the court ahead of time, but it takes time for things to filter down and everything, and they just couldn't understand that me being there at the start and getting a transparency order and having that, you know, kind of either okayed or not okayed for publication before the court proceedings started, that was their notice, and they had wanted, like, you know, all of this notice to be able to prepare for a journalist, and which is also very interesting, because I'd like to think they'd do the same kind of preparation if a journalist isn't there. But, you know, maybe that's a bit of a sign. And, you know, having judges who, as well, just kind of saw it differently to me, and saw that they had the kind of final say of whether I'd be there, whereas I knew that this wasn't an adoption case, this was an open case, I could be there. And also on practical logistics as well, we mentioned it earlier about the listing code, completely useless. That none of the cases actually had the listing codes on them for that week, and the issue I came up against during the week was that some of the cases have been, because of the delays, some of the cases had been listed way before the reporting trial was announced. So then the court had this list, and the usher was telling me, you can go to any of these, and when I was saying, okay, but which one's a Cat C, which is part of the reporting pilot, nobody really knew, because they'd been listed before Cat C was a thing. So I could still go, but there was just so many little niggly things to kind of get around. But yeah, it was a really good experience as well in kind of the start. I hope to be able to get to that point of feeling more closed off, because I did feel quite emotionally drained at the end of each day, kind of having to be that, you know, wanting to say to these families, I'm not here to, like, you know, I do actually care, but you can't. You just have to be, you know, I'm here to do a job, and be very professional about it. But that's difficult in the face of families that, you know, have lost a child or things like that. It's a bit different, I think, to, you know, the juiciness of a criminal court. It's kind of, it's a lot more domestic, which is a good thing as well, because you can bring, I think as you mentioned, it's, you know, the legal side is one thing, but then the kind of ethics of how you talk to people is something that you make your own, and it's so true about building relationships, is kind of you decide what kind of journalist you want to be, all within obviously the legal parameters and things like that, but you can bring your own kind of style to things, which is something I think, you know, maybe it's quite hard to teach because you're maybe not sure of that until you're actually in the situation. Yeah, I don't know if there was anything else.
I think that's it, because Richard's been trying to pull out the plug for our
Yeah.
microphone, and unfortunately he pulled out the wrong plug, so we're going to carry on talking. No, I think that's it.
Can I just make one last point, just based on things that people have said, is that one thing that I think has worked really well for us is that, obviously, just by the nature of the way that we have to teach, we have to treat them all as like separate topics, and teach defamation, and teach them court reporting, and teach privacy, and teach all these things, but being able to show them the thread that connects it all together and how all of these topics link up is something that I felt has worked really, really well for us. And as you said, like it's more than just one thing at a time, and suddenly you've got all these different areas are being brought in. And so that's probably one of the things I would say works actually really, really well for us. And I think we've said that quite a few times, is that it's not just these aren't just individual topics. It's not that defamation is a defamation case, and you're going to go and learn about that and only be able to report on your risks of defamation.
Particularly, I think, around contempt and privacy these days, reporting on arrests and all that sort of stuff. That can make it. There's overlap that again is quite hard to teach them about.
So, if only there was someone who'd written a book about this stuff.
There you go. Well, I'm just gonna carry straight on and do the end bit just now. So, but just before I do, thanks to this great team from St George's. And I'm just going to hold fire here and just carry straight on. So you can sit and look awkward if you like. It's all fine by me. But thanks, that was really great, really interesting stuff. So it's me again. I'm going to say a few words to both close the day's formal proceedings, but also tell you a bit more about my book, which more in a second. But before I do, I really want to thank everyone who's taken part today. Thank you to all the presenters who've given us a flavour of their projects, the research they've been doing. The more we know about court reporting, about open justice, about media law, the better informed industry leaders, those in criminal justice, politicians, policymakers will all be. The more options we have, the better prospects we have of not just keeping court reporting going, but strengthening it for the future, including allowing more and easier opportunities for not just journalists, but others as well, to take part in the observation of the courts. Thank you to everyone who took part in all our panels and discussions. This event was all about being a connection between academic research, journalism training, the experience of working court reporters, perspectives from those outside the media but still interested in observing the courts, and of course those in the justice system in one way or another. I think we've managed to bring out a huge amount of topics and themes to take away with us and discuss and work on, develop. I'm looking forward to seeing what comes out of all of that. And a special thanks as well to Sian Harrison for her brilliant keynote speech this morning. So thanks to everyone. Okay, one thing to reiterate is I'm going to be writing to those of you who presented today about the possibility of contributing to a new book, not this one, a new one, an edited collection on the themes around court journalism, open justice, media law, observation of the courts, teaching of court reporting, and so on. So look out for that in your inboxes fairly soon. Anyone else interested in contributing to something like that, just call me in a minute or send me an email, whatever you like. I want to thank the university and especially the School of Arts, Media and Creative Technology for making this event possible. Thank you again to Emma Barnes, Knowledge Exchange Fellow, for all her help. Thank you to everyone here at Media City, Estate, Security Reception, also catering, for looking after us today. Thank you especially to Rob for the live stream, which is available on the Quays TV YouTube account. Thanks to Rob. And those recordings will be there after today, so you can watch them back. You can relive the high points of the day, or you could share them with others, however you like. They're an open YouTube account. I also want to thank the National Council for the Training of Journalists, the NCTJ, for agreeing to sponsor this event. They're also supporting some networking drinks, which will take place in a moment back there. And a reminder that we'll be there until about 5:30. And at that point, if you want to carry on the conversation or buttonhole somebody you haven't had a chance to speak to yet, we'll be moving out and downstairs to the Seven Brothers Beer House, which is just downstairs out on the plaza but underneath us. It's a great local Salford brewery run by Seven Brothers, one of whom I do know. He's the secretary of the cricket club I play for, so no real surprise we're going there. That is an example of real local corruption that you can get stuck into. Before all that, though, we've reached the really important part of the day in which I transform into a book salesman. I've published this book, Reporting the Courts, with Routledge, came out last winter, and this is the formal launch right now. So I'll tell you a bit about it. This book was a slow train coming. I actually started looking at this topic of court reporting that you're also interested in more than 10 years ago. I worked at the University of Huddersfield at the time, was quite new to working in universities, and Huddersfield had a policy, and still does, of getting all academic staff to do PhDs, which was pretty interesting policy. It wasn't popular with everyone. Lots of people thought better of it, took voluntary severance or whatever, but it was good for me. So they paid for me to do the PhD, which was great. And actually, they paid for me to do it remotely through Cardiff University because there wasn't anyone local to supervise it. And they basically let me do anything I wanted. So it was amazing, really. So thank you to all sorts of people at the University of Huddersfield for that. Like with probably all ex-journos who end up in universities, the first thing they gave me to teach was media law, of course. And so I thought I may as well do my PhD about that. Specifically, what I was interested in even then was the idea that as print newspapers might be getting a bit smaller, a bit thinner, as we've talked about, certain elements of local life were migrating to other places. You might not get coverage of the local Sunday League football or the church fete in your newspaper anymore, but it's all over Facebook at the Times, everywhere else. Reports and pictures are there for people to find. But I realised that was never going to really be the case for the courts. It was going to be much harder for that to be so. Courts are a special case in journalism. To observe a case, you need to know where it's happening. You need special legal knowledge to be able to accurately publish material about it. And journalists have traditionally had that. But if we didn't have maybe so many journalists in local communities in the future, it seemed unclear to me what might happen. And the clear risk was and is that cases effectively happen in secret. So any public quality our justice system has is diminished significantly if media and other observers are not often present. At the same time, as I was sort of thinking these big thoughts, more local magistrates' courts were closing, as we've discussed, and that obliges everyone involved to trail a fair old distance to the nearest larger courts complex. So again, the effects of that weren't yet apparent at the time I was first thinking about these issues. So I did this as a PhD part-time, and I finally finished off about 4 or 5 years ago. That was a pretty busy time in the sector. You might remember it. But I did eventually get a book proposal together and got it accepted a couple of years back. And I was able to set about updating that book with lots of new interviews, including with people in this room, a new content analysis of the output of some newspapers, as was discussed earlier, and also an ethnography where I pestered Andrew for a week and followed him and others around Manchester Crown Court. So if I was going to sum up what I found, it would be in part that there is an impressive quality and at times quantity of court reporting around, especially in the regional press. In some ways, these challenge narratives around a perceived decline in the quality of local media. Yet we are very reliant on the big 3 major press companies, all represented here today. And it's no secret those organisations are facing acute financial challenges, meaning court reporting to me still does face a potentially precarious future. Yet at the same time, at least some of the criticism journalism faces today is to some extent based on a kind of nostalgia for a theoretical golden age that maybe never quite existed in the way it's sometimes imagined. And I do demonstrate in the book how for major regional daily titles at least, the depth and the range of court reporting is, if anything, maybe even better than it has been for a long, long time. The book critically examines coverage of the courts in the context of financial crises, which have diminished both the news industry, also the criminal justice system over the past decade and more. And I get into the norms of how court journalism emerged and evolved. We heard quite a lot about contempt today. The chapter on the evolution of court reporting restrictions focuses on the 1981 Act, why it's so strict. Peter Sutcliffe was arrested right in the middle of the passage of the bill through Parliament. It's fair to say there was some interesting reporting of that that I don't think would pass muster today. Certainly egged on as well by the behaviour of senior police on that occasion in West Yorkshire. And that really rebounded on the media in general during the subsequent debates and has coloured really media reporting of crime in the courts ever since. So this book considers how court reporting is practiced today, including the use of cameras, social media, and remote hearings as well during and since the pandemic. And I get inside that major murder trial, the Brianna Jai case at Manchester Crown Court 18 months ago. And all the while, I've aimed to explore why court reporting remains worth preserving and enhancing, and I've offered some recommendations which could help maintain and extend coverage of the courts. So without giving away too many spoilers, I thought I'd end by giving you a flavour of those to finish the day. So those include further review of the restrictions on photography, audio and video recording within court buildings, even in courtrooms. We all know how important multimedia content is to the visibility of court stories. We also know how we're always walking around with incredible content creation devices in our pockets these days. It seems to me that old arguments that applied back in the 80s around the disruption caused by clunky old tape recorders maybe no longer apply. It's right to look again at what might be appropriate, if only to make going to court more of a sure thing for reporters. If you go today, you're guaranteed a great story or 3, and often they'll be exclusive to you if you're the only journalist there. But if you could also record audio perhaps, or had the opportunity to take higher quality photographs than those dodgy snatch photos that you get, you'd get not just a great story, potentially some great audio-visual content as well. It might make editors in the room a bit more likely to invest in court reporting at every title, every day. There's been a lot of chat about the Local Democracy Reporting Service, the LDRS, over the years and today. It's not always, but in the main, I might say it's been a rare example of relative harmony between the BBC and the press, I'm going to put it that way. It's certainly widely admired and copied around the world. I don't think it's realistic or even appropriate for more licence payers' money to go into that scheme to expand it to the courts, although I know some people in the industry do favour that. But I do think there's potential value in seeing about expanding the Sentencing Remarks video project that we heard about earlier, finding alternative sources of money perhaps to have maybe more pooled content from a greater variety of trials around the country, making that easier for news companies to run and embed on their sites, with ads around it where it's appropriate to do so. Access to evidence presented in open court in a timely way is something extremely important for newspaper journalists in particular, something they often struggle to get. One thing we haven't really discussed today, but one thing came out of my book is that the CPS might put a bit more resource and urgency into providing CCTV or images of a more significant trial. And they do that if coverage on regional TV news is assured. When it's just the written press interested, reporters tell me it can be a lot tougher to get hold of that kind of stuff. And that does have an impact on the stories they can run and how prominent they are. Consistency of facilities across courts, as we've heard, is a real bugbear. You're now lucky if you've got a press room. You're sometimes even luckier if you know where the key is. I'm sure everyone in the room would agree that reporters don't need much. A cubbyhole with a desk and a couple of chairs in it is okay. Obliging journalists to work in corridors, in the corners of cafes, right next to defendants, solicitors, family members is not acceptable. Courts ought to do it. Again, it demonstrates a general sense that some reporters have, in some locations, that they're not always welcome. But it is a disincentive to court coverage more generally. It's important. If you can't park, if the Wi-Fi is patchy, if you have to work in the corridor, if you have to sit in the public gallery because there's no press seats in the court, if you don't know whether you're going to be able to get that CCTV clip that is going to make the difference between your story getting published or not, these are factors that make it less likely court reporting takes place. Then there's information about court cases themselves, both listings in advance, lists of cases that have been settled under the single justice procedure. When we have the legal profession understandably looking to online dispute resolution via apps, eBay as a potential template of how certainly civil but maybe even minor criminal cases might be resolved now and in the future to help speed up the process and ease those backlogs we've heard about. It's not really clear how journalists and other observers fit into that kind of picture. So there's a lot more about all that in all the book. Rather than just give it all away, and I know I'm preaching to the converted really because, if you've spent all day listening to people talk about court reporting and media law, it's right up your strasse. I would encourage you all to read it. These academic works are very expensive as standalone things, so don't go and put one on your Christmas list unless you've got a spare large sum of money. But please do, if you work at a university or whatever, add this to your reading lists, encourage colleagues and students to take a look. The more successful this book is, the more likely it is we'll do the other one that I mentioned. So also the more likely it is we get more days like today. Who knows? Maybe we'll do this again one day. So with that, I'd like to finish off. I'd like to invite you all to join us next door for a chance to round off the day with some networking. Thank you all very much.